Hello, and welcome to this clean, historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. The Abandoned Bride by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1. Pelham, New York, 1881. If that delivery boy lets us down one more time, I'll go to the store and give him what for. How can we prepare luncheon for Mrs. Ricci and her friends when he's brought us the wrong coffee beans? Doris Haggerty shook her head with annoyance before clambering onto a chair. She stood on her tiptoes to reach onto the little used top shelf in the pantry. "It's all right," she shouted over her shoulder. "We still have a bag of her favorite beans left over from Christmas." She smiled with satisfaction as her fingers closed around a parcel at the back of the shelf, and she blew the dust off it before nimbly jumping down again. "Thank you, dearie. I don't know what I'd do without you." Enid Batchley eased herself up from the chair next to the range where she'd been taking the weight off her feet for a moment. After being cook for several generations of the Ricci household for more years than she cared to remember, she figured she'd earned it, and her arthritis had been troubling her more than usual lately. "We were never this rushed when it was just Sophia and old Mr. Ricci to take care of, but I suppose it's the way of things with a new mistress," Doris remarked. "It sounds like Sophia loves her new life out west, and her baby might be born by the next time we receive a letter from her." Doris sighed. She still missed their old mistress, even though she had left well over a year ago. It had been a shock for everyone when old man Ricci's unexpected death and the subsequent reading of his will had revealed that Sophia had a half-brother called Leonardo she had never met. And even more of a shock when the family's elegant brownstone house and his flour milling business had been left solely to Leonardo, leaving Sophia penniless. "Well, I'm very glad things worked out so favorably for her," Mrs. Batchley said. She tipped some coffee beans into the grinder and started turning the handle. "She was always a kind and thoughtful girl, and doted on her pa. It's nice that she has a new family of her own now. And her husband sounds as if he loves her very much indeed. Much like my Frederick loved me, God rest his soul," she added. Doris's face took on a dreamy expression as she recalled how romantic Sophia's courtship had been with the rugged rancher she had traveled to Oregon to marry. After a hesitant start, he had swept her off her feet, and Sophia had told Doris that being a mail-order bride was the best decision she'd ever made. "I wish I could meet someone like him," Doris said wistfully. Beneath her no-nonsense manner, she had a romantic heart, and loved nothing more than hearing about her four sisters' courtships and happy marriages. Now that she was in her 20s, she was more than ready for her own happily ever after, and was eagerly looking forward to having children with a caring husband. But so far, the only man who had expressed an interest in courting her was a middle-aged chimney sweep who reeked of stale whiskey and was overly familiar in a way that left Doris feeling repelled. The last time he came to the house, he had cornered her and declared that she would make a fine mother with hips that wide, before laughing at his own uncouth comment. She was grateful he wouldn't be back for a while, now that it was summer. "You will soon enough, dearie. All your sisters met fine young men, didn't they? It will be your turn next, I'm sure." Cook tried to reassure her, but lately she could tell Doris had been feeling downhearted. The last thing she wanted was to end up being a spinster, working for the Riccis for the rest of her days. "That's the thing, Mrs. Batchley. All four of my sisters were courting by the time they turned 20. Maureen is happier than ever with her new husband in California. Even our Ivy, who had to wait 4 years for her beau to propose, said I must be doing something wrong to get so little interest." Enid harumphed. Over the years, she had heard every detail of the Haggerty sisters' lives from Doris. They were a rambunctious family, constantly squabbling and making up again like a gaggle of magpies. But their careless remarks about Doris could sometimes be hurtful, and they probably didn't even realize how much their youngest sister took them to heart. "It's not that you get no interest. she said stoutly. It's because the new mistress keeps us so busy. You don't have time to meet a nice young man of your own. Maybe someone at church might catch your eye? Before Doris had a chance to ponder this thought, a rustle of silk announced Jane Ricci's arrival as she swept into the large kitchen. I don't pay you to stand around gossiping, she snapped, giving Doris a pointed look. I'm sorry, ma'am. I was just going to start peeling the potatoes, and then I'll make the fruit pies as you asked me to. Doris bobbed her head and turned back to the vast sink. Even though Mrs. Ricci's waistline was already thickening with the pregnancy of her second child, she was remarkably light-footed and had a habit of sneaking up on her staff, determined to find fault. Cook had once muttered darkly that it was because she felt insecure as she hadn't been born to wealth, but Doris reckoned Mrs. Ricci just had a mean streak, plain and simple. You will make sure the cakes are nice and light for tomorrow, won't you, Cook? I don't want my guests to think that their hospitality is better than mine. Of course, ma'am. I'll make your favorite Victoria sponge with freshly made raspberry conserve and whipped cream. You can rest assured, Miss Ricci always used to say my cakes were the best in the district. Jane Ricci sniffed at the mention of her sister-in-law. She had always felt somewhat inferior to her and had wasted no time in refurbishing the house to her own taste, finding Sophia's rather plain. Now, every room had luxuriously swagged velvet drapes, and there were expensive ornaments dotted on every surface that the maids had to keep free from dust. She was determined her new high society friends would realize how wealthy Leonardo was after inheriting his papa's business. He might have been born out of wedlock, but Leo was a man to be reckoned with in Pelham now, she told herself. Mr. Ricci is doing so well with the flour mill that I have decided we shall have a party to celebrate, she said, wanting to demonstrate that she was very much in charge. The fact that the servants still spoke so fondly of Sophia annoyed her greatly. I will send out the invitations this afternoon, but I would like you to start thinking about the menu, Cook. Ooh, we haven't had a good knees up at the house for a long time, Doris said happily. It certainly won't be anything so vulgar, Mrs. Ricci shot back. She eyed Doris with an irritated frown. I expect there will be 10 couples, and I want it to be the most talked-about event this summer, with exquisite food and the best wines served. We'll look forward to the opportunity to impress your guests. I'm sure it will be the envy of all your fine friends, ma'am. Mrs. Batchley knew how to flatter her mistress and bustled to the table with her recipe book, keen to make a start. Thank you, Cook. I knew I could rely on you to understand how important such an event is, especially now that dear Leo is preparing to expand the business. We'll get all the best silverware and crystal glasses out, Doris said. The dining room looks lovely with all the candles lit. We won't let you down, ma'am. I know we ain't had a fancy evening like this for a little while, but I was trained well by the old housekeeper, and I know just how to make everything look perfect for you. Mrs. Ricci fingered the velvet ribbon at her neck with a distracted expression. I'm still not sure you're quite ready to take on that role, Doris. You are very young, and there are certain standards my guests would be expecting that Sophia would probably not have known about. You haven't had much experience of putting on grand events because Leonardo's papa was virtually a recluse by all accounts. She paced around the kitchen table, and then her expression brightened. I have come to a decision. I think it's time we had a butler. All of our friends have one, so we must too, and I think I know just the fellow. Cook and Doris shared a surreptitious glance between themselves. Old man Ricci had always said the house wasn't large enough to merit having a butler, but that was probably precisely why Jane Ricci would insist upon it. As you like, ma'am. I'm sure you'll choose only the best person for the job. Exactly, Mrs. Batchley. Standards might have slipped when Leo's papa was here, but they certainly won't now that I'm in charge. Over the next few weeks, Doris quickly wished Mrs. Ricci had kept her plans to herself. Wendy, the young scullery maid, could scarcely string a sentence together. She was so nervous about the thought of a new butler ruling over them all, and Mrs. Batchley had taken to muttering darkly about too much change being the end of her. I'm sure it won't be that bad, Doris said, trying to lift Cook's gloomy mood. She paused from her task of carefully picking bones out of a side of poached salmon to make a tureen. It was unseasonably warm, and Mrs. Ricci had requested only the lightest, most appetizing food be served to her. It's been a while since she told us. Maybe she hasn't managed to find anyone suitable after all. Mrs. Batchley smiled with grim satisfaction at the thought. We've managed perfectly well without a butler all these years. Just you wait, Doris. We won't get a moment's peace. He'll be checking up on us all the time. When my sister was in service, she said their butler had more airs and graces than the master of the house, even though he was just an old fellow who worked his way up. Why do I want some doddery old fool telling me how to cook when I've been doing it all my working life? I'm sure he won't interfere too much. Doris strained the poaching milk and added a bay leaf and a twist of pepper before setting the pan back on the stove to make a sauce. Besides, you've worked for the Ricci family for so long, I don't think anyone would dare to tell you what to do. The rest of the morning passed quickly as Mrs. Batchley reviewed the menu for the party again. It was still a few weeks away, but experience had taught her that the time would race by, and it was a matter of pride that she wanted to do her best. When she had first started working for the family, their dinner parties had been reputed to be the finest in the district, and she didn't want the gossip below stairs amongst Mrs. Ricci's friends to be that she was past her best. I'm going to make a start on polishing the silver in the dining room, cook. Will that be all right? Doris fetched her basket of rags from the pantry and was just about to hurry away when they heard voices approaching the kitchen. Let me introduce you to the rest of the staff, Mrs. Ricci cried. She swept in from the hallway, looking pleased with herself. This is Mr. Wallace, she announced, gesturing to the tall gentleman who was standing deferentially behind her. Our new butler, she added. Good morning, ladies. I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance. Piers Wallace stepped forward and extended his hand, swiftly shaking hands with Cook and then Doris. I see you keep the kitchen absolutely spotless, and something smells delightful. Mrs. Batchley shot the young man a startled look. He was not at all what she had been expecting. Yes, thank you, she muttered. And you, Miss Haggerty, I can tell that you take your duties very seriously. He turned to give Doris the full force of his smile, which only got wider as he saw 2 pink spots of color appear on her cheeks. I do, Mr. Wallace. It's kind of you to say so. Mrs. Ricci fanned herself as the heat from the range wafted in her direction. I'm going to lie down for half an hour before luncheon is served. I think tomorrow morning would be a good time to go through the menu again for the party. She gave Cook and Doris a firm look. Mr. Wallace is in charge now. I expect you to help him settle in as quickly as possible. Yes, ma'am. Doris bobbed a curtsy, and their mistress glided away. Mr. Wallace strolled around the kitchen, lifting saucepan lids to peer in at the contents, and she took the opportunity to look at him more closely while his attention was elsewhere. From everything that Cook had said to her over recent weeks, she had expected their new butler to be old and gray, but Mr. Wallace was nothing of the sort. He looked to be about 35 years old, and his dark hair was swept back from a high forehead. I've heard good things about you, Mrs. Batchley, he said smoothly, clearly trying to flatter her. Mrs. Batchley had recovered her composure and gave him a hard stare, determined not to be a pushover. Maybe, Mr. Wallace, but I can't say I've heard of you. Are you local? I've come to Pelham through a recommendation from one of Leonardo Ricci's business acquaintances, he said, not fully answering the question. I'm sure we'll get along famously, and I won't step on anyone's toes. Cook sniffed and eyed him suspiciously. We'll see, she muttered before bustling off to the pantry with her list. Oh dear, I don't think she likes me. Piers grinned at Doris, looking contrite. I can only hope you won't judge me as harshly, will you? Doris? Can I call you Doris? Maybe you and I can be allies? It's not easy starting in a new household, and I could sure use a friend to help me settle in. Doris felt her heart beat faster as he stepped closer. There was something about the way his gray eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary that made her feel slightly breathless. I'm happy to help you, Mr. Wallace. Cook's bark is worse than her bite. You'll soon win her around, I don't doubt. Thank you, Doris, and you must call me Piers when we're alone. He rested his hand on her shoulder and gave her another smile. It can be our secret. And don't worry, I know you haven't had a butler overseeing things before, but I think you'll find I'm a fair taskmaster, especially for the people I like best. Doris's cheeks turned an even deeper pink, and she turned away to busy herself with finding the silver polish in the cupboard under the sink, hoping that he wouldn't notice how flustered he made her feel. She couldn't wait to tell her sisters about the handsome new butler who was paying her so much attention. I'd better get on Mr. Wallace. I mean Piers. Mrs. Ricci is always saying I talk too much. Of course you don't. And what of it? I find you quite charming. Piers strolled back out of the kitchen in Doris's wake with a self-satisfied smile, admiring the way her hips swayed as she hurried toward the dining room. He had been in two minds about whether to apply for the job when his friend had told him about it, but now he realized it might serve him very well, especially with Doris to brighten his days. Chapter 2. Pelham, New York. The day of the party dawned fair, and Doris felt a shiver of excitement as she pulled her plain black dress over her head and tied her apron around her waist before hurrying down the servants' stairs. Her first tasks of the day were to lay the table in the dining room and arrange all the hothouse flowers that had been delivered the evening before. The sun had only just risen, and she yawned as she came into the kitchen, feeling slightly guilty because Mrs. Batchley had already been up for an hour and her face was red from the heat of the stove. "You'd better be quick eating breakfast, Doris," she said, dipping a spoon into a vast pan of bubbling soup to taste it. She added a couple of pinches of salt and then stirred it again before putting the lid back on. "The cook from Lady Sawyer's house will be begging for this recipe, but I'm sure not going to tell her," she added with a chuckle. "I do declare you're enjoying this, aren't you?" Doris ladled some porridge into her bowl and sat next to Wendy, who still looked half asleep. "I've got my reputation to maintain," Cook replied with a smile. "News travels fast between the servants of different households as well, you know. If everything goes to plan, Mrs. Ricci's guests' servants will be talking about this meal for years to come, if I say so myself." Piers strode into the kitchen, overhearing her comment. "They could all learn a thing or two from you, Mrs. Batchley, if they did but realize." "Doris, are all the wine glasses out in the dining room? You did remember that we need different glasses for each course, didn't you?" "Doris? I think you mean Miss Haggerty, don't you? Mrs. Ricci doesn't like the servants to be overfamiliar." Cook's tone was crisp, and she gave Doris a warning glance. Something about the butler's demeanor troubled her, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The rest of the servants found him charming, but she had a bad feeling about the way Doris's eyes softened every time she spoke to him. Piers simply chuckled. "You're quite right, of course, Mrs. Batchley. Where would I be without you to keep me in line? I'll see you in the dining room once you've finished your breakfast, Miss Haggerty." He put extra emphasis on his last two words, which made Doris roll her eyes at Cook's retreating back. "I'll be along shortly. I just need to fetch the flowers from the cellar, where the gardener said I should put them to keep cool." "I'll look forward to it," Piers said softly, once Cook had disappeared into the pantry. "You do look very beautiful today, Doris," he added in a whisper, raising his eyebrows suggestively. Wendy's eyes snapped open as she sensed the hint of intimacy in his tone, and he winked at her, tapping the side of his nose. "No need to tell Mrs. Batchley, eh, Wendy? You know you're my favorite scullery maid I've ever had the pleasure to work with. Doris and I are just friends, so you don't need to say anything to Cook." He winked again and strode off, whistling under his breath. Wendy's eyes widened with intrigue. Even though she was only 11 years old, she found their new butler very dashing, and she nudged Doris with her elbow. "I think Mr. Wallace has taken a shine to you, Doris. Do you think he might even marry you one day?" she asked dreamily. She clasped her rough, chapped hands under her chin and fluttered her eyelashes, giggling again. "Maybe when I'm older, I'll meet someone just like him, too." Doris gave the young girl a fond smile. "Maybe, Wendy, although you're far too young to be thinking about romance at your age. Now, you'd better get into the scullery and wash the dishes. You know, Cook needs all the help she can get today." As Doris started to gather all the cutlery for the place settings on a tray, She let her thoughts wander. Piers had been at the house for almost a month, and it struck her as ironic that Wendy would be looking up to her about matters of the heart, when until so recently, she herself had thought she would be a spinster forever. Much to her surprise, Doris couldn't deny that there was a spark of attraction between her and Piers. And if the way he sought out her company was anything to go by, it was a mutual attraction. The thought gave her a warm glow deep in her heart, and she hummed as she worked. She was falling in love, and just as her sisters had always told her, it felt wonderful. No good will come of it, dearie. Men like him are only after one thing. Mrs. Batchley's blunt words felt like being doused with a bucket of cold water as they intruded on Doris's daydream. She stood in the pantry doorway with her hands resting on her broad hips and shook her head. I hope to goodness you're not falling in love with him. I don't know what you mean. Mr. Wallace isn't like that, Doris said hotly. Besides, he's only trying to help me get better at the job. He said he might put in a good word for me with Mrs. Ricci for the housekeeper's role. I ain't blind, Doris. I've seen the way you look at him. You mustn't fall for his charm. We still don't know much about what he was doing before he came here. I don't like it. If you ain't careful, he'll tarnish your reputation, and then where will that leave you? Doris felt a surge of resentment towards her old friend, thinking how unfair it was that just as she was wondering whether Mr. Wallace might want to court her, Cook seemed determined to spoil things. She tilted her chin defiantly. Mr. Wallace says I'm very ladylike, as it happens, Mrs. Batchley, and I certainly wouldn't dream of doing anything like what I think you're hinting at. She picked up her tray and marched out of the kitchen, not giving Cook time to reply. As she laid the table, her fit of temper subsided, and she decided she would apologize to Mrs. Batchley as soon as they had finished with the party. She hated the thought of there being any bad feelings between them, and she knew her friend was only looking out for her, even though she couldn't understand why she had such a low opinion of Piers. He had been nothing but polite to all of the staff since arriving. Aha! There you are, my dear. The sound of Piers behind her made Doris's heart skip a beat. He put his hand over hers and turned her around to face him. I can't stop thinking about you, Doris. I know it's frowned upon for staff to have romances between each other, but I can't keep my feelings for you a secret any longer. Doris gasped. It was the first time he had spoken so intimately to her, and she felt the blood rush to her cheeks. That's kind of you to say so, Piers, but if I'm to be promoted to housekeeper when you put in a good word for me. She felt the words die on her lips as Piers clasped her hand even tighter. He stepped even closer and gazed down into her eyes. She wondered for one dizzying moment if he was going to kiss her. Have you done the flowers yet? Mrs. Ricci's querulous tone from the hallway made Doris spring back from Piers, and she hastily straightened her apron, trying to regain control of her tumultuous emotions. Piers smoothly turned away to start arranging the decanters of drink on the sideboard, not looking flustered at all. Yes, I mean, not quite yet, ma'am. Doris's hands trembled as she finished laying the final place setting. I'll get to that right away. Jane Ricci peered at Doris with a worried expression. Are you sickening for something? Your eyes look too bright for my liking. I do hope not. I can't afford for any of my servants to be off today of all days. No, ma'am, it was just a little warm in the kitchen. Doris scurried away before Mrs. Ricci could say anything more. Does Piers want to start courting me? Might he want to get married, as Wendy said? The happy daydreams put a spring in her step, and her face split into a wide smile. She tried to ignore what her sister Ivy had said when Doris had confided in her recently, telling her that it was unwise to even consider a relationship with Piers because she could lose her job over it. Ivy is just jealous because her beau was so dull, she whispered to herself. The thought buoyed Doris up for the rest of the morning as she darted from one task to the next. She knew that Piers was nothing but gentlemanly, and if he did decide to court her, he would only do so with a view to getting married because he would never want her to risk losing her position, not when he was such a kind and thoughtful person. I think we can say that the evening was a great success, Cook. Thank you for all your hard work. It was the end of the day, and the grandfather clock in the hallway had just struck 10 o'clock. Mrs. Ricci stood in the kitchen, smiling at them all and looking unusually content. "I'm very pleased everything went to your liking, ma'am. And if you don't mind me saying, you are a very accomplished hostess." Mrs. Batchley was feeling bold because she had treated herself to a glass of cooking sherry after the last plate of food had gone out to the party guests. But it was the rare praise from her mistress which made her plump cheeks glow. "And thank you as well, Miss Haggerty. You conducted yourself well this evening. I can tell that my decision to employ a butler was the right one. Mr. Wallace seems to be having an excellent effect on the household." Mrs. Ricci covered her mouth and yawned daintily. "I shall take breakfast in bed tomorrow morning. As pleasurable as the evening has been, I'm exhausted from it." With that, she glided away. "Well, knock me down with a feather," Cook chuckled as she sank gratefully into the chair next to the range. "I wasn't expecting such high praise from the mistress, but I sure do appreciate it. You look exhausted as well." Doris poured out 2 mugs of hot chocolate and passed one to Mrs. Batchley and one to Wendy. "Why don't I finish tidying up in the kitchen for you? You've both been up since before 5 this morning." Wendy's eyelids were already drooping before she had even finished her drink, and Doris shooed her away toward the servants' stairs. "My feet are aching something terrible. Are you sure you don't mind?" Mrs. Batchley sipped her drink and yawned loudly. "I do find events like these more tiring than I used to." She gave Doris an apologetic glance. "I'm sorry I snapped earlier today. I just don't want to see you get hurt. A nice young man from church would be better for you than Mr. Wallace, don't you think?" Doris nodded, not wanting to spoil the evening by disagreeing. "Why don't you take your drink up to bed? There's not much left to do." She helped Mrs. Batchley to her feet again, and a moment later the kitchen fell quiet, save for the quiet ticking of the clock on the dresser. "I thought I would never get you alone, Doris. Have the others gone to bed already?" Piers sidled into the kitchen carrying a cut glass jug, which he put on the table before producing 2 glasses from behind his back with a flourish. "You did amazingly well tonight. I thought we should enjoy a glass of fruit punch together. It will only go to waste otherwise." "Are you sure, Piers?" Doris felt a flutter of excitement in her chest at the way he gazed at her so appreciatively. "I don't want to drink liquor. That wouldn't be right at all." "You are so innocent, my dear." Piers handed her a glass and then held his up, chinking them together. "It's just a little fruit cordial, nothing to worry about. You've worked so hard today, you deserve it." Doris sipped the drink, enjoying the fruity flavors. She had been so busy serving the guests that she had barely had time to eat or drink since lunchtime, and she realized how thirsty she was. "Mrs. Ricci is very pleased with your work, Piers. She said you're having a good influence on us." Piers smiled and put his glass down, topping hers up again from the jug. "There's only one person whose opinion I care for, Doris, and it's you. Are you courting anyone at the moment?" he added casually. "No, there's nobody special." Doris suddenly felt lightheaded and overcome by a reckless urge to declare how attractive she found him, but she bit her lip to keep the words back. She wanted to preserve her modesty, and she had prayed in every spare moment over the last week that he might not find her too plain to consider courting her. As if reading her thoughts, Piers gave her a soft smile. "If I were to have a wife, which I do very much long to do soon, it would be someone just like you, dear Doris. I only hope that perhaps one day you could find it in your heart to consider courting me." He topped up her glass again, urging her to drink it. "You really are delightful, my dear," he said in a soft voice. Doris smiled slowly up at him, feeling as though courting him would be like all her hopes and dreams coming true. A wave of tiredness washed over her, mixed with a peculiar lightheadedness. It was as if all the hard work of the day, followed by the emotions of hearing these declarations from Piers, was too much, and she felt her eyelids getting heavy. Piers watched her intently, but she could barely focus on him, and the room started to spin, making it hard for her to concentrate on what he was saying. The strangeness of the feeling was almost like being in a dream, and it was all she could do to carry on speaking. "I'm just so happy. We must talk more, another time." "Of course, Doris, but sometimes we don't need words. when actions say so much more, don't you agree? Somehow, Doris summoned the strength to nod, thinking how wonderful it was that Piers was so considerate. The last thing she remembered from the busy day was him courteously putting his arm around her shoulder, murmuring that he would help her up the stairs. Chapter 3. Griffin Creek, Oregon, 1881. Bryant's General Store had been in Levi Bryant's family coming up for 30 years. It was a fact that weighed heavily on Levi's mind as he opened the window shutters early one morning, just as the town of Griffin Creek was coming to life. When his pa, Benjamin Bryant, had first arrived in Griffin Creek, it had been little more than a dusty outpost, and like most people, he had only ever intended to pass through on his way to find gold and make his fortune. But fate had had other ideas. The ramshackle saloon and boarding house at the edge of town, where he had paused for a few nights to rest his weary horse and buy supplies, was managed by a curmudgeonly fellow, Nate Anderson. Benjamin had kept himself to himself, not wanting to mingle with the hard-drinking, loud, cussing men who drank whiskey as though it was water and who played cards late into the night, trying to win back the coins they couldn't afford to gamble away. But Nate Anderson didn't run the place alone. He had a daughter called Jasmine, and it had only taken one evening of watching her graciously deal with the drunks and cleverly keep them plied with just enough liquor to keep the money rolling in, to persuade Benjamin to stay a little longer, in the hope of getting to know this intriguing young woman and winning her heart. After a whirlwind romance, Benjamin and Jasmine had gotten married, and a week later, Nate Anderson had dropped dead after stepping on a rattlesnake when he'd climbed out of his wagon on a grassy roadside to check that his horse hadn't thrown a shoe. The first few years of Benjamin and Jasmine's marriage had been hard, with them both as hot-headed as each other about how they wanted the business to look. But as time mellowed them and the first flames of passion turned to a deeper, lasting love, they finally agreed that a general store would be the way ahead, instead of continuing with old man Anderson's original dreams of a saloon. Griffin Creek was changing before their eyes, from a dusty one-horse staging post into a thriving frontier town, with ranches being settled all around and new businesses springing up to serve everyone who was traveling west. After 5 years of hard work, the day they hung the wooden sign out the front, declaring their new business, Bryant's General Store, was open, Jasmine had whispered to Benjamin that the Lord had blessed them in more ways than one. She had been carrying their first child, who they dreamed would inherit the business one day. Even then, it had been touch and go whether the store would survive. Many days, Jasmine had to think of creative ways to use up the scraps of vegetables they had left over from the store, bulked out with stale bread, to keep her growing family fed. Every spare cent went toward purchasing supplies to fill the store. They opened before dawn to catch the early risers and closed after dark in case newly arriving travelers wanted to purchase something. But gradually, word got around that they had the best selection of goods in the district, whether it was flour and dried fruits for baking, bolts of colorful cloth in the latest styles from the fashionable East Coast, tea leaves, coffee beans, and spices straight off the ships docking in New York from exotic countries far away, or the freshest bread and cakes baked by Jasmine early every morning. Bryant's General Store catered to every need. Their family of 3 soon became a family of 5, as Jasmine and Benjamin welcomed 2 more children into the world. Levi was the eldest boy, then James and Lily followed afterward, each of them a manageable 3 years apart. Life was good, and Benjamin gave thanks every Sunday for his blessings. But one summer, when Levi had just turned 15 years old, Benjamin persuaded Jasmine to accompany him on a trip to New York to celebrate 20 years of being married and to help him choose new goods to sell in the store. 2 weeks later, Benjamin's older sister, Maud, disembarked from the train in Griffin Creek with the sad news that Benjamin and Jasmine had died unexpectedly from typhus fever that they had caught from an insalubrious guest house where they had been staying. Maud had been with them for their final days, and she told the 3 children that she would be doing her duty and taking care of all that was left of her family. Levi let his memories of the past drift through his mind as he leaned on the wooden railing out the front of the store, watching the town slowly waking up. The summer sun had just broken over the top of the mountains, casting the streets in a golden haze, but he barely noticed. Thoughts of the business filled his head, and had done so for so many years that it was second nature. He had stepped straight into his pa's shoes when Aunt Maud had arrived all those years ago, and had focused every waking moment on being the head of the family and making sure the general store was run as he knew his parents would have wanted. His younger brother, James, was as different from him as night was from day, and he often wondered how they could have come from the same kin. Levi was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a chiseled face and a sweep of dark hair. He had the easy air of a man who knew he was good-looking and the self-assurance of being the eldest that went with it. By contrast, James was a shade shorter, with a lean frame, tousled blonde hair, and dark blue eyes that often seemed to be looking into the distance, as though he was dreaming of something others couldn't see. While Levi had followed in his pa's footsteps, wanting to make the store profitable at any cost, James took after their mom more. She had encouraged his love of baking, and a few years ago, with Levi's agreement, James had refurbished the dusty storeroom next to the main store to open a tea room. As he'd explained to Levi, it made sense for their customers to be able to stop for refreshments when they came to do their shopping. Their younger sister, Lily, encompassed the best of both of them. With a sunny disposition and a kind heart, she wanted nothing more than to settle down and have a large family. But both of the Bryant men protected their beautiful little sister like a rare treasure. If any suitors had ideas of courting her, they were quickly fended off, and Levi would glare at the high-spirited young bucks who loitered outside, hoping to catch Lily's eye, making it known that her virtue would be protected by whatever means. Aunt Maud had never married, and now that she was in her 60s, she had started to feel her age. She had always been sprightly and a keen member of all the charitable groups in town, but lately her thoughts had started to turn to the future. She wasn't going to be around forever, and she never forgot her solemn promise to her brother just before he had died. Benjamin had clasped her hand and with much wheezing and coughing had pleaded that she would guide Levi, James, and Lily to live a godly life and would also do her best to provide a safe home life for them while they continued the business and good family name. It was this which had prompted her conversation with Levi the night before, which was now weighing so heavily on his mind. Levi had been feeling unsettled for the last few months. At first, he thought it was just from the long winter they had all endured. It had been the coldest one for as long as he could remember, which had kept travelers away and meant that business had been slow. But as the seasons turned and the first green shoots of grass had coated the paddocks in a verdant haze, followed by the cherry blossoms on the trees, Levi had realized what it was that was missing from his life. It wasn't more success for the store, but a companion to share his life with and a desire for more adventure. Even though they lived in town, in a generous cabin behind the store and with all the amenities on their doorstep, Levi had always told himself he was too busy for love. He had seen how his parents had doted on each other, and that was what he wanted for himself as well. Most people regarded him as a hard-headed businessman, with a hide tougher than leather and a temper to match. But beneath his brusque exterior, he had a soft heart. The long winter had made him feel lonely. He wanted a wife to come home to, someone who would share his hopes and dreams. He imagined a beautiful woman with a sense of adventure, who would help him feel less shackled by work and give him a reason to take picnics by the river or ride out to the woods for the day, just for the fun of it. This realization had made him start frequenting the saloons lately, a change in behavior that had not gone unnoticed by the family. After casting his mind around for ideas, he figured it was the only way he could meet someone. He thought back to the previous night when Aunt Maud had asked him to come into her parlor after dinner, closing the door discreetly behind him so James and Lily wouldn't overhear their conversation. "I'm going to come straight out and tell you that I'm worried about the future," Maud had said with no preamble. "You seem to have your mind on other things lately," Levi, staying out late. There's no need to be worried, Levi had shot back defensively. As much as he loved his aunt, he had noticed her disapproving looks on recent occasions. I've worked hard to make the general store a success. Can't I go out and let off steam now and again? Maud had gathered her shawl around her shoulders and sat in the wingback chair next to the window that she favored, because it overlooked the garden, which was her pride and joy. I've noticed a bit of a wild streak in you recently, Levi. She smiled gently to take the sting out of her words. You remind me of your pa when he was younger. He had so much drive and determination. He could never sit still for a moment. But when he met Jasmine and they got married, that's when he finally settled down. Uh-huh. Levi felt the sudden pang of missing his parents, which still snuck up on him sometimes. I remember how much they loved each other. Maybe one day I'll go the same way. That's why I've been going out more to see if I can meet someone. Maud nodded slowly. I figured as much. And has anyone caught your eye? A nice young lady who will support you in the business? Well, Griffin Creek ain't exactly overrun with nice young ladies who are single and looking for love, Aunt Maud. Levi fidgeted, wanting to leave. He still had to stock the shelves for the next day, and he had promised some of the gold prospectors who drank at the saloon that he would call in after work to play cards. There was also a new, curvaceous redhead behind the bar who had smiled at him more than usual a few days before, even though he knew she wouldn't be the sort of person his aunt would approve of for marriage. The thought made him feel even lonelier than before, which put him in a sour mood. When your pa died, I promised him I would make sure the future of the business would always be secure, Levi. It needs to be, not just for you, but for James and Lily as well. Don't you think I know that? Levi muttered with a sigh. It's all I think about, morning, noon, and night. I'm getting older now, Maud continued, as though he hadn't spoken. She sat back in the chair and looked up at him. We couldn't have managed without you, Aunt Maud. I'll always be very grateful for your help. Levi realized that he had taken his aunt's presence for granted, and now he looked at her more closely. He could see that her petite frame seemed to have shrunk more than he'd noticed, and her eyes didn't have the sparkle they once had. I'm not planning on dying anytime soon, she had chuckled. But it's up to the Lord when it's my time to go. The thing is, I want to make sure things are in order. As you know, the business is in my name. Benjamin insisted because you were still only 15 when he died, and that's what he instructed the lawyer back in New York the day before he passed. Levi had nodded. This was nothing new, and he had always assumed that the business would pass to him. Being the eldest, it seemed only right. What I've never told you until now is that your pa also said that he only wanted you to inherit the store if you were happily settled and married to the sort of woman your parents would have wanted for you. Someone with good morals, who would be there for you and support you, as Jasmine did with Benjamin. Levi's head had snapped up at hearing this news. You mean I have to meet someone you approve of, or else I lose everything I've worked for all these years? Maud had shaken her head. It's not that I must approve, Levi, but I think we both know that the sort of women you've been dallying with in Griffin Creek aren't those who your parents would have had in mind for you in the business. How did you know? Levi had blustered. It's just a bit of fun. I'm sure, Levi, but the time for fun is over now. You're in your late 20s, and it's time to settle down with someone suitable. I shall be meeting with the lawyer to go through my will sometime soon. I shall honor your pa's wishes and make you the main beneficiary if you are able to marry someone suitable. Levi had felt his anger rising, but had managed to bite it back. And if I don't wed someone before James does, what happens then? Does it all go to him? You know he wouldn't last 5 minutes running the business. He's a dreamer and always has been, Aunt Maud. She had eased herself up from the chair again and walked over to take Levi's hands into her own. The last thing I want is to pit you against your brother. I'm not blind, Levi. I can see that you're lonely. Meeting a gentle, kind woman and marrying is just what you need. I trust you to do the right thing, and I'm sure you'll be happier for it. Chapter 4. Griffin Creek, Oregon. Levi sighed again as he returned inside the store. The familiar scents of coffee, spices, cigars, and the new gentlemen's hair pomades they had started stocking didn't give him the comfort they usually did. It was as if his duties and obligations were chafing him, like a harness that was too tight on a horse, making him irritated and short-tempered. Now that Aunt Maud had given him what amounted to an ultimatum, he felt it even more keenly, and he paced up and down the wooden floorboards like a caged bear. He wanted romance and the sort of happy ever after his parents' marriage had been, but if he was being honest with himself, he suspected he didn't have the patience to achieve it. In his mind, it was more important that he expanded the business than waste time chasing after his dreams. But there was also a part of him that longed to walk away from all his responsibilities and go far away, enjoying more adventures, like the gold prospectors described, where they had no ties and could travel on a whim. Penny for your thoughts? James appeared in the doorway between the general store and the tea room, coming in for the supplies he would need for the day, as he did most mornings. Levi grunted non-committally. He wasn't sure he was ready to share his thoughts with his younger brother yet. Nothing you need to worry about. You just enjoy dabbling in that kitchen of yours and leave the proper business to me. He felt a pang of guilt when he saw the hurt show in James's blue eyes at his sharp words, but didn't apologize. Dabbling, huh? Is that what you call it? I was doing the books last night, and the tea room is almost turning the same profit as the general store now, Levi. It seems folks like eating here more than you might think. James spoke with quiet confidence. He knew there was no point in antagonizing Levi when he was in this sort of mood, but he did at least want him to know his part of the business wasn't the hobby Levi liked to imagine it to be. So we're doing all right then? Levi frowned and ran his hand through his dark hair, making it stand up. He didn't care much for figures, preferring to be on his feet taking action rather than sitting behind a desk. Luckily for him, James loved nothing more than balancing the accounts when he wasn't dreaming up new recipes for the tea room. He was a curious blend of scholarly and creative, which suited Levi perfectly. Well, the bad winter didn't help, but the business won't go bust, if that's what you're thinking. James started weighing out some flour to make the meat pies, for which he had gotten a good reputation. What did Aunt Maud want with you last night? Levi shrugged and decided to come clean. She doesn't like me running around with some of the women I've been seen with. I reckon someone must have reported back to her. He gave James a suspicious look, but his brother just chuckled. You should know you can't keep any secrets in Griffin Creek, Levi. Why? Are you thinking about courting one of them? Nope, not any of those ladies. Nothing's happened with them anyway. They're just good company to chat with. At least they've had a life away from here. The one I think Aunt Maud is referring to is from New York. The way she describes it makes me want to go there and see it for myself. No chance of that, though, with this place to run. Pa used to travel away looking for things to sell. Who's to say you can't? You don't need to rely on the traveling salesman coming to town. Yes, but it didn't end well for Pa, staying in New York, did it? Levi snapped. If they hadn't stayed in that cheap boarding house, they never would have caught typhus and died. Aunt Maud wants me to get married to a nice young lady and settle down. In fact, she's as good as told me I won't inherit the business unless I do. Ah, now I understand why you look like you've been chewing on a hornet this morning, James chuckled. He had never expected to inherit Bryant's general store, so there was no malice between the two brothers about it. As long as he could continue doing the accounts and serving his customers in the tea room, he would be happy. I don't think the sort of woman Aunt Maud wants me to wed exists in Griffin Creek, Levi said morosely. There are hardly any single women as it is, let alone the sort she would think suitable. Well, you know Jonah the blacksmith found himself a lovely girl from the East by advertising in the Matrimonial Times. Molly's pretty enough to turn heads and kind with it. James had been pleased for their friend when he had remarried, and it had almost made him consider doing the same, but he had never plucked up the courage. Place an advertisement? Levi groaned and shook his head. I ain't got time for that sort of nonsense. Anyway, what would I say? bad-tempered store owner seeks a beautiful, patient wife who is happy to muck in and work all the hours God sends, as well as provide 4 strapping children. James grinned as he folded the top down on the sack of flour. Very amusing. I've looked after the family okay, haven't I? You could find something a bit nicer to say about me. Levi caught sight of himself in the mirror by the pomades. How about calling me a good-looking businessman? His words fizzled out, and he tried again. Sensible woman wanted to help run a thriving business? He threw up his hands in frustration. I don't know what to say. It seems like a mighty complicated way to get a wife, if you ask me. Do you have a better idea? You said yourself there aren't many single women in Griffin Creek. You might be waiting a long time. Aunt Maud made it clear she wants to see me married soon, and I like the thought of having a wife. I guess it wouldn't harm to try what Jonah did. Levi scratched his head, looking perplexed. Why don't you do it for me, James? You're much better at that sort of fancy stuff than I am. James gave him a steady look before relenting. All right, I'll write the advertisement. Just don't hold me responsible if you don't end up with someone gorgeous who loves you as much as Ma loved Pa. Okay? I guess I'd better mention you snore like a grizzly bear and you don't have a romantic bone in your body, he added with a twinkle in his eye. Levi turned the sign on the door to show they were open, knowing that his brother was just teasing. James might not be as sharp at business as him, and they'd had their differences over the years, but he was as loyal as a faithful hound when it came to family. He trusted James to show him in a good light, and if it saved him the bother of having to do it himself and kept Aunt Maud happy, so much the better. If he was lucky, he might be corresponding with a pretty girl within weeks. And if he could persuade James to help him write the letters, it wouldn't even take any time out of his day. After the last customer had paid for their meat pie and potatoes, and Lily had finished clearing the counter and washing the dishes, James finally sat at the table nearest the window with a pen and paper, enjoying the peace and quiet of the tea room now that he had it to himself. He had barely heard anything Lily had chattered about that day. All that had been on his mind was writing the advertisement for Levi. His hand hovered over the paper, and he waited for the right words to come to him, but it was as if all rational thought had fled from his mind. So much for me being better at this sort of fancy stuff, he muttered with a rueful smile. He stood up again and poured himself a mug of coffee before sitting back down and looking out of the window. Griffin Creek looked at its best at this time of year. Some of the trees in the park opposite the store were still in blossom, and he watched strolling families pausing to chat with each other with easy familiarity. He loved how friendly the townsfolk were and wondered whether that sort of thing would appeal to someone coming to live here from a busy eastern town, where he had heard folks scarcely knew one another, let alone stopped to say hello. He took a long sip of his coffee, wondering how best to describe what Levi would be looking for in a wife. Still, the words wouldn't come to him, and he suddenly remembered what his friend Jonah had said. The blacksmith hadn't known what to write about himself, and he had enlisted the help of Molly, who at the time had been married to Owen Webb, who had turned out to be a violent thug, robbing innocent travelers. But what stuck in James's mind was that Jonah said Molly had told him to write what was in his heart, rather than trying to pretend to be something he wasn't. Maybe if I write as if it was me looking for a wife? The thought suddenly made James's task feel much more achievable. Levi and I are brothers, after all, more similar than different. I expect that would work just fine. He quickly put pen to paper and wrote the advertisement. He described how their business was busy, but never felt too busy because they were such a part of the community that it was a pleasure to serve their customers. And he said how he hoped the right woman would enjoy living in a town where people were friendly and cared for each other, even if they didn't have the latest fashions or fancy entertainment cities in the East might offer. Lastly, he said that he wanted to offer security and love that would last a lifetime, and hoped the right woman would want the same as well. As he read it through, he wondered whether he should mention physical attributes. He knew Levi like a certain type of woman, buxom, with a flirtatious demeanor. the very opposite of what would appeal to him and what it sounded like Aunt Maud had suggested. He wondered how to phrase it and settled eventually with saying that looks weren't all that mattered, as long as the right lady had a kind heart, wasn't afraid of hard work, and was willing to do her best to fit in. He drained the last of his coffee and tidied up after himself. He would take the advertisement to the Heart's Delight matrimonial agency in town, which was the one Jonah had used. As he turned the lamps down and headed for the cabin out the back, he felt his spirits lift. If this worked for Levi, he decided he might even try it for himself. Levi wasn't the only one in the family who had been feeling lonesome recently, and his curiosity was piqued by what sort of woman might decide to travel such a long way to marry someone they had never even met. Chapter 5. Pelham, New York. Doris bustled into Mrs. Ricci's parlor, where she was reclining on her chaise longue, fanning herself languidly. "Your lemonade, ma'am. Cook has made it not too strong, just how you asked. Put it on the table." Jane Ricci opened her eyes and sighed extravagantly as she heaved herself into a more upright position. "This weather really doesn't agree with me. The sooner my confinement is over, the better." Doris wasn't sure what to say. She knew that her older sisters had both become rather short-tempered in the weeks leading up to having their babies, but with Mrs. Ricci, she just had to politely accept her mercurial moods. "Is there anything else I can do for you, ma'am?" She edged toward the doorway. "The nanny has taken Master Edward to the park, so you won't be disturbed." Jane Ricci fanned herself more vigorously, giving Doris a stern look. She suspected that the servants were being idle while she was indisposed, and was determined not to let it happen for a moment longer. "I noticed that the silver in the dining room needs cleaning, Miss Haggerty. You shouldn't need me to point it out to you." Doris bobbed her head. "Certainly, ma'am. I'll do it this afternoon." She hurried away, biting back her sigh. She had cleaned the silver only last week, but she didn't dare show Mrs. Ricci to be in the wrong. After lunch, she laid all the cutlery out on a soft cloth and started polishing. It was repetitive work, but she didn't mind at all. It gave her the opportunity to let her thoughts drift over the last few weeks, which had been most delightful. Ever since the evening of the party, Piers had been extra attentive, taking every opportunity to come and find her in a quiet corner of the house and whisper sweet nothings in her ear. She blushed as she remembered a few days ago when he had suggested that he would like to kiss her passionately, and even more. "I hope you ain't falling for all his flattery," Mrs. Batchley had warned on numerous occasions. "If you end up in the family way, Mrs. Ricci will throw you out without a reference, and you could end up in the workhouse if you ain't careful." Doris paused from her polishing, allowing herself to daydream about a future with Piers. He had described how he would like them to have a home of their own and several children. And then his hands had wandered over her until she'd had to wriggle out of his embrace, reminding him that she was not the sort of woman who had easy morals. "But you already." Piers had bitten back his words, leaving Doris feeling confused. She had allowed him several chaste kisses, just brushing her cheek, but his demeanor was possessive, almost as though they were already a couple. When she had pushed him gently away, giving him a coy smile, for one moment she thought she had glimpsed anger and frustration in his gaze, before he hastily agreed that, of course, he would be happy to wait until after they were married. He had marched out of the room, leaving her wondering what she had done wrong, but then she told herself it was just because he loved her that he could hardly bear to wait until they could be together. After Doris had finished polishing the silver cutlery, she took all the tureens and serving platters from the sideboard and laid them out on the table. The room felt unusually warm, and she wrinkled her nose at the overpowering smell of the cleaning paste Mrs. Ricci demanded they should use. Dabbing it onto the first platter, she suddenly felt her stomach churn, and she quickly opened the window to try and capture the hint of a breeze from outside and air the room. "Are you all right, dearie? You've been looking a bit pale this week." Cook's question as she bustled into the dining room made Doris jump. "It's nothing, Mrs. Batchley. Just this heat, I expect." Doris suppressed a yawn and stood a little closer to the window, hoping that the feeling would pass. Have you ordered different cleaning paste? This smells much stronger than the one we usually use. She fanned her handkerchief in front of her face, trying to fight the next wave of nausea that swept through her. No, it's the one we always use. Cook peered at Doris more closely. I hope you ain't sickening for something. I reckon that piece of ham you ate yesterday could have been on the turn. Why don't you go and sit down for 10 minutes? Mrs. Ricci has retired to her bedroom, so you won't be missed. Doris shot her a grateful smile. I think I will. I just feel so tired. I'm not sure what's come over me. I'll make sure it's not for long, though. Mrs. Ricci wasn't in a very good mood this morning. Mrs. Batchley's eyes narrowed thoughtfully as she watched Doris hurrying toward the small back room where the servants were allowed to relax on a Sunday afternoon for a couple of hours. Usually, she had more energy than any of the maids, but since the butler had been fraternizing with her, Doris had seemed distracted and overly emotional. She decided she would have to tell Doris to pull herself together before Mrs. Ricci noticed it as well. Miss Haggerty, come to the dining room this instant. Jane Ritchie's strident command from the hallway woke Doris with a start. She glanced at the clock on the mantelshelf and realized with a shock that she had been asleep for almost an hour. Jumping up from the armchair, she hastily straightened her apron and scurried after her mistress. What is the meaning of this? Mrs. Ritchie's expression looked thunderous as she gestured at the silverware that was still on the table where Doris had left it. I am sorry, ma'am. I got distracted by something else. I'll finish it immediately. Can't you see what I mean? Mrs. Ricci pulled herself up to her full height and glared at Doris. There's a silver platter missing. I have looked in the sideboard and asked cook, but nobody knows where it is. A tide of red flushed her cheeks, and she pursed her lips. It belonged to Leonardo's papa. Have you stolen it? Doris gasped at the accusation. No, ma'am. I would never do such a thing. Now that you mention it, I can see that it's not here, but I know how much all the pieces mean to Mr. Ricci as a memory of his father. I promise I haven't done anything so sinful. She felt tears stinging the back of her eyes, willing her mistress to believe her. I shall give you the benefit of the doubt for one day, Miss Haggerty. If the platter is safely back here tomorrow, your job is secure. But if it isn't, you will have to leave your employment without a reference. She waddled to the sideboard and counted out the other items before turning to Doris again. I will not tolerate such behavior, she snapped. Now get out of my sight. Doris ran down the hallway, almost blinded by her tears, and then paused at the bottom of the servants' stairs to collect herself. She prided herself on her loyalty to the Ricci family, and to be accused of stealing from them was such a shock that she could scarcely believe her ears. As soon as her tears were dry, she hurried through the narrow corridors at the back of the house to the butler's pantry. Piers, something dreadful has happened. As Doris burst through the door, Piers hastily closed the drawer under his desk with a look of annoyance. Goodness, Doris, you made me jump. It's polite to knock first, you know. Mrs. Ricci has accused me of stealing a silver platter, Piers. It's not true. But if it's not found before tomorrow, she said I'll lose my job. Fresh tears pooled in Doris's eyes, and she threw herself into his arms. What am I going to do? She waited for Piers to reassure her, but he pulled back and folded his arms. Have you stolen it? He asked crisply. Doris's eyes widened with disbelief. Of course not. How could you think such a thing? She looked at the cigar, which was resting on an ashtray next to the window, and suddenly felt her nausea return as the smell of the smoke hit her. Is that one of Mr. Ricci's cigars? She gagged slightly and grabbed the glass of water on his desk, gulping it down. What of it? Piers stubbed it out and gave her a long look, taking in her pale complexion and the slight tremble of her hands. Are you ill? He demanded. I've been feeling sick for a few days, Doris replied. Cook thinks it's something I've eaten. I'm sure I'll be fine tomorrow. I see. Piers ran his finger around his collar as though it was too tight and turned his back on her to look out of the window. You'll stick up for me, won't you, Piers? You know I would never steal from the family. She slipped her hand into his and looked up at his handsome face. Maybe this is a sign. You said you wanted us to be able to start courting and get married. Perhaps you could tell Mrs. Ricci that I'm not a thief and that we're to be wed? Come, come, Doris. Piers cleared his throat and pulled away again. We don't want to rush into things, do we? You know you wouldn't be able to continue working if we marry. I'm not really in a position to support you yet. You need to trust me to know when the time is right. And until then, I must insist that nobody is to know we have feelings for each other. But what about the silver platter, Piers? If I'm thrown out, how will we be able to see each other? I might end up having to go away and live with one of my sisters. I don't think I could bear the shame of being falsely accused of something I haven't done. A terrible thought occurred to Doris. What if Mrs. Ricci tells the police? I could end up being sent to prison. You're getting hysterical, my dear. Piers patted her shoulder and smiled, but he seemed preoccupied. Let me look for it. I'm sure it has just been put away in the wrong place. Mrs. Batchley can be terribly forgetful, and Wendy hardly knows what day of the week it is most of the time. Doris felt a wave of relief that Piers was taking matters in hand. I knew I could rely on you, she said, squeezing his hand. Even though she had hoped he would propose, she understood that he wanted to be financially secure to provide for her. I'd better get on with my chores. That's perfect, my dear. Don't worry yourself about it. I'll come and see you first thing in the morning, and I'm sure everything will be all sorted out, and Mrs. Ricci will be calm again. He gave Doris a wry smile. I think her confinement is making her imagination far too vivid. Now run along and leave everything to me. That night, Doris tossed and turned in her narrow bed, finding it 1 minute too warm and the next feeling chilled as the sweat on her face cooled. It was the longest night she could ever remember, and the only thing which stopped her from pacing around the servants' quarters with anxiety was Piers' reassurance that it was all just a misunderstanding and would blow over in no time. Eventually, the darkness started to turn into the gray of just before dawn, and Doris couldn't bear to wait a moment longer. Throwing back the thin sheet and blanket, she quickly got dressed and splashed some cold water on her face before coiling her brown hair into its usual bun and securing it with hairpins. She tiptoed down the stairs, wondering if Piers was up already. Piers, are you there? She tapped on the door of the butler's pantry and waited for his deep voice to summon her in. There was no reply. Piers? Doris turned the door handle, expecting it to be locked, as was customary when Piers wasn't there. She could hear Wendy clattering the ash buckets as she made a start on cleaning out the fireplace in the drawing room down the hall. The pantry door was unlocked, and as it swung open, Doris gasped with shock. It looked as though the room had been ransacked. Drawers were half open, and the cupboard where the expensive liquors and cigars were usually stored was empty. Stumbling back out of the room, Doris ran down the hallway. Cook, we've been burgled. Where is Piers? I must tell him right away so he can send for the police. She ran further down the hallway, seeing the glimmer of lamplight from the dining room. Piers, are you here? She ran through the door and stopped in her tracks. Every cupboard door was open, and other than one stray spoon on the floor, there was not a single item of silver left in the room. He's gone, dearie. Mrs. Batchley's expression was grim as she laid her hand on Doris's shoulder. Our thief is Piers Wallace, I'm afraid. I've had my suspicions for a while that he was up to no good. I happened to get up earlier than usual this morning, worrying about that silver platter. And you. The gardener just came in and said he saw Piers leaving with several large bags an hour ago. He thought nothing of it, but Piers must have slipped away with all the family silver. He's a wrong un, that's for sure. Doris felt her legs buckle, and she collapsed into the nearest chair. But he said he wanted to marry me, Mrs. Batchley, she whispered. He told me he loved me, and I believed him. Chapter 6. Pelham, New York. You've got a letter, Doris. Mrs. Batchley pointed to the envelope on the dresser and poured them both a cup of tea. It looks like it's from Miss Sophia. Why don't you read it to me? It will be good practice for you. It had been 2 weeks since Piers's shocking departure, and although Doris still felt upset that he had turned out to be a thief and a liar, she was at least grateful that Mrs. Ricci had accepted she'd played no part in the theft. The police had been alerted, but he was long gone. She knew she had to accept that he was probably far away, living on the spoils of his deception, and had never had any intention of marrying her. Doris eagerly opened the envelope. Hearing from her old mistress, Sophia Ricci was always a tonic. They were of a similar age, and although they were from very different backgrounds and social classes, Sophia had always treated her as much as a friend and confidant as a maid, especially after losing her ma when she'd been young. "Well, go on then. What does she say?" Mrs. Batchley settled on her chair, glad to rest her weary legs for a few minutes. "Has she had the baby yet?" "Dear Doris and Enid," she read out. "I hope my letter finds you both well. Things are still as busy as ever here at Willow Ranch, but I wouldn't have it any other way. My most delightful news is that our baby has arrived, and what a blessing he is. We have named him Alfred after Papa, and Maddie is such a good big sister to him. She loves to help me bathe and dress him. Corey is thrilled, of course, and is already talking about how he will enjoy teaching him to ride and working together on the ranch in the future. Grace and Hank have really helped me settle in. They are the best relations I could have wished for. I feel as though I have so many new friends in Griffin Creek as well, even though we don't get into town that often. Folks enjoy stopping to chat, and there are lots of community social events to be part of. Grace and I enjoy the sewing circle with the other wives. We are making clothes and quilts for the needy at the moment. When I think back to my grand social life in Pelham, it feels so different. But I must say I'm very happy with my simpler life out west. Are you courting yet, Doris? I still remember what you said at the station when I was leaving about following me out west if you didn't meet a suitable gentleman at home. I'm sure someone as kind-hearted as you is probably courting already. But if you aren't, maybe you should consider what I did and look in the Matrimonial Times. I can honestly say that I give thanks to the Lord daily that I came west and married Corey. We are so happy together, and I would dearly like to know that you would be happily married as well one day, Doris. I must end now as Alfred has woken up, and Hank promised he would take my letter into town as he has supplies to fetch from the mercantile store. Best wishes from your friend, Sophia. Doris felt wistful as she read the last few lines of the letter. She remembered only too well what she had said to Sophia as she waved her off on her new adventure. But it had been said in jest. She had never imagined she would need to look beyond Pelham, where she had lived all her life, for a suitor. But since Piers's casual disregard for her feelings, she found herself wondering whether Sophia's suggestion might be worth considering. Mrs. Batchley watched the emotions chasing across Doris's face. "Why don't you get the Matrimonial Times, dearie?" she said eventually. "It didn't do Miss Sophia any harm, did it? We can both remember how heartbroken she was after that rogue Mr. Westwood let her down, and now she's as happy as anything by the sound of it." "But it was different for her," Doris countered. "Sophia is so beautiful and graceful. I'm not surprised Corey fell head over heels in love with her." She sighed disconsolately and pushed her unfinished cup of tea away. It didn't taste quite right, and she wondered whether the tea merchant had been adding something unsavory to the tea leaves to bulk them out with a cheap alternative. "Now then, I won't listen to that sort of talk," Mrs. Batchley said firmly, tightening her apron strings, ready to start work again. "Looks ain't everything a gentleman wants in a wife, you know. Besides, you're pretty enough, even if you have been looking a bit pale lately." "Thank you," Doris chuckled. "I got so used to my sisters telling me I was the runt of the family. They said it in a good-natured way, but after everything that's happened, I did wonder if that was why Mr. Wallace decided not to court me. Pay no heed to what he did. He was a wrong un right from the day he arrived, I reckon. You're better off without him." Mrs. Batchley sniffed with disapproval and patted Doris on the shoulder. "I need you to fetch me more eggs and milk so I can make Mrs. Ricci some nice plain foods for her confinement. You can get a copy of the newspaper when you go. It's about time you put all that other business behind you, and I think this is the best way to do it." Doris nodded slowly and then tidied the table. She was still feeling tired and emotional because of being betrayed by Piers, to the point where it seemed as though the slightest thing made her want to cry, even something as simple as Cook being kind to her. "I suppose it won't harm to look at the advertisements." Maybe I could meet someone like Corey and be as happy as Sophia. As the thought took shape in her mind, she decided to do as Cook had told her. She would put the past behind her and see who might be looking for a mail-order bride. It had worked well for her old mistress and her sister, Maureen, so there was no reason why it shouldn't for her too. An hour later, Doris weaved through the busy market stalls of Pelham, heading to the general store the Ricci family favored. The sun beat down on the cobbled street, and flies buzzed on the rotting piles of cabbage leaves and muck from the street sweepers in the gutters. There was hardly any breeze, which meant that the smoke belching out of the many factory chimneys lay like a thick, sulphurous blanket over the town. Most of the wealthy families of Pelham would escape to cooler houses in the country at this time of year. But the doctor had advised Mrs. Ricci that travel in her condition was unwise. By the time she arrived at her destination, bursting through the door of Franklin's general store and slamming it firmly behind her, Doris was trembling with agitation. On a whim, she had decided to take a shortcut through a back street she didn't usually venture on, only to find herself slap bang in the middle of two rival gangs running after each other, brandishing knives and pistols, not caring who else got hurt in the process. She was lucky to have gotten away with her reticule still clamped under her arm, and nothing worse to show for it than her nerves being in tatters. "Are you okay, Miss Haggerty?" The store owner's wife, Betty Franklin, bustled over. "The Irish and Eastern European gangs are worse than ever, Mrs. Franklin. I won't risk going that way again, that's for sure." Betty tutted loudly and propelled Doris to a chair in the corner so she could catch her breath. "I don't know what this neighborhood is coming to," she grumbled. "It used to be quite pleasant, but now it's filthy, and we scarcely dare go out after dark. Rest up a while and tell me what your order is, so I can get things ready for you." She took Doris's basket and went to turn away. "It's just things for Cook to make plain food for Mrs. Ricci's confinement." "Ah, yes, she must be having the baby any day." Betty's eyes softened. She had 7 children of her own and loved hearing news of new babies being born. "I remember I went off all my favorite foods when I was expecting," she reminisced. Doris soon felt better and went to stand at the counter. "I'd better get some cigars for Mr. Ricci, too." She consulted her list. Mrs. Batchley hadn't mentioned cigars, but since Piers had been in charge of ordering them as part of his butler duties, she didn't want Mr. Ricci to run out now that Piers was gone. "The usual ones, please." Doris wrinkled her nose as Betty opened the glass-fronted cabinet where the cigars were all lined up. "I don't know how Mrs. Ricci can bear the smell of them. I used to like them, but these last few weeks, cigar smoke makes me feel quite nauseous." Betty hesitated as she wrapped the parcel and gave Doris a shrewd look. "You ain't in the family way, are you, Miss Haggerty?" she whispered, her eyes widening with intrigue. "I was exactly the same when I was expecting with all of my children. Couldn't bear the smell of cigars. Poor Mr. Franklin had to serve them to our customers for me, as it made me feel sick." Doris paused from where she had been fanning herself, looking at Mrs. Franklin with shock. "Certainly not. It's just something I must have eaten, is all." She felt the color rising in her cheeks as Betty patted her hand. "You wouldn't be the first young lady to be in trouble, dear. Have you been feeling that way for a while?" She gave Doris's slim waistline a curious stare. "Just a few weeks," Doris mumbled. She tightened her shawl and turned away from Mrs. Franklin's prying gaze. "I'm not even courting, so what you're suggesting is ridiculous." "If you say so," Betty replied. She filled the basket and pushed it back across the counter, slipping some mint humbugs in at the last moment. "These used to help me, dear. I hope the gentleman in question will do the honorable thing if it turns out not to be something you've eaten." Doris's head was spinning as she walked home. She was not completely naive, as several of her sisters now had children, and she shuddered at the thought that Mrs. Franklin had thought she would have such loose morals as an unmarried woman. Her thoughts drifted back over the time that Piers had been with the household. He had cornered her and kissed her cheek several times, but she had been adamant that there must be nothing more. But what about the night of the party? Doris prodded at the memory like a tongue seeking out a sore tooth. She had never fully understood how she could remember so little of that night. She knew Piers had plied her with glass after glass of fruit punch when they were alone in the kitchen and had promised her it contained no liquor, but after that everything was hazy. The one thing that had stuck in her mind was how surprised she had been to smell the faint lingering scent of his hair pomade in her bedroom the following morning. It must have just been from where he helped me up the stairs, though, she told herself firmly. She had a vague recollection of his arm firmly around her waist, helping her up the narrow stairs, but that was all. Enough of this nonsense, she muttered out loud. The idea that Piers could somehow have taken advantage of her was ludicrous, not least because Mrs. Ricci would not tolerate having an unmarried mother as one of her maids, and surely Piers would not have stooped so low. She lifted her chin and strode back toward the market, taking the safer route this time. She was sure Cook must be right, and it was just something bad she had eaten. Glancing down at the Matrimonial Times, which rested on the top of her basket, she smiled happily, deciding to put Mrs. Franklin's comments and any lingering doubts of her own out of her mind. She would look at the advertisements and pray that someone suitable would catch her eye. Chapter 7. Griffin Creek, Oregon. James closed his notebook and slipped it into his saddlebag. He had a rare couple of hours to spare, and had taken the opportunity to ride out of Griffin Creek to his favorite spot on the river where he could dream up new recipes for the tea room. The fronds of the weeping willow trees trailed into the water, and birds darted over the surface of the deep pool where the water flowed slowly, catching flies. Every now and again, the water splashed as a fish jumped with a flash of silver in the sunlight. The angle of the shadows told him it was time to be heading home, and he vaulted lightly onto the leather saddle, clicking his tongue to urge his horse homeward. As he trotted along the dusty track, his thoughts turned to the letter in his saddlebag. The postmaster had flagged him down earlier, handing it to him with a cheerful grin, telling him it would save him a trip delivering it to the store. The writing was feminine, with a slight slope, and James knew it could only mean one thing. Someone had replied to Levi's advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. "What do you think she's like, Silver?" His gray mare flicked her ears at the sound of his voice and trotted faster. He couldn't help but feel curious about who had replied to what he had written for Levi. He only hoped that his brother would treat the situation with the respect it deserved. Levi had a rough edge about him sometimes, forgetting that folks had feelings that could get hurt by his brusque manner. Even between the two of them, Levi often let his competitive streak get the better of him. When they'd been growing up, being the eldest, Levi had always been the first to learn from their pa. Benjamin had taught him everything to do with the general store and how to ride a horse and shoot a gun, telling him often how Levi would be carrying the mantle of the good family name and everything they had built. It seemed as though when it had come to James's turn, Benjamin had lost interest, thinking that as long as Levi was being molded into the sort of son he wanted, that was all that mattered. Looking back on it now, James understood that their pa had simply taken pride in his firstborn son. But at the time, he had wondered whether his pa had regarded him in a less favorable light. He figured that Benjamin had seen more of himself in the first signs of the rugged man Levi would soon become, compared to James, who took after their ma, enjoying books and learning. "Get up, Silver." James squeezed his heels against the mare's flank and grinned broadly as she took off at a gallop, kicking up plumes of dust in their wake. The long grass whipped past them, and he laughed out loud at the thought of how shocked his family would be if they could see him. Just because he loved to cook for the tea room and settle the accounts didn't mean he didn't love the freedom of galloping over the wide pastures of Oregon with the wind in his face just as much as his brother. Levi might have been seen by everyone in town as the rugged head of the family, but James could be every bit as masculine when the inclination took him. By the time James got back to town, the sun was casting a rosy glow over the mountains, which rose like a jagged spine in the landscape, softening to woods and pastures below. He unbuckled the leather straps and slipped the mare's saddle off before patting her neck affectionately and turning her out into the paddock. They were lucky that although the town had grown around them, their pa had had the foresight to buy a parcel of land behind their log cabin and the store, so it felt like they still had a little slice of the country amidst the bustling streets. Been taking it easy, daydreaming at the river again, have you? You know you'll never find a good woman under them willow trees, don't you? Levi's loud bark of laughter, which accompanied his question, set James on edge. Clearly, he'd been at the saloon enjoying a few glasses of whiskey, but he never missed the chance to poke fun at the way James liked to spend his precious spare time. Yep, James said easily, not wanting to get Levi riled up. I'm happy enough with my own company. If I wanted to meet a woman, I'd write me an advertisement and pray that a reply might just come. Right about now, I reckon. He lifted the saddle off the rails and threw the bridle over his shoulder before heading toward the shed nearby, giving Levi a grin over his shoulder as he passed. Levi strolled behind him before giving a whoop as he finally caught on. Are you telling me it worked? I've had a reply? Uh-huh. The postmaster stopped me earlier. As for whether it's worked, I can't say. You'd better read it, I guess. He pulled the letter out of his saddlebag and held it out for Levi to take. Levi stepped back, looking slightly alarmed. Oh, you know I ain't one for words, not like you. He rubbed his hands together and nodded his head at the envelope. Go on, then. You'd better read it. Let's hope she's pretty. I don't want to be tied down with some old matron who's seen better days. He laughed coarsely, not noticing James's look of annoyance. Surely you'd rather take it and read it in private, Levi? She might end up being your wife. Levi shrugged. Don't make much difference, does it? Quit being such a ninny. He flopped down on the bench on the veranda and looked up at James expectantly. She ain't gonna even know you've read it, so stop making a fuss. James wondered why Levi was being so lackadaisical about it, but then shrugged. There was no point in trying to unravel his brother's moods when he got argumentative after too many whiskeys. He carefully opened the letter and began reading. Dear Mr. Bryant, I'm writing in reply to your recent advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. My name is Doris Haggerty, and at the moment I am a housemaid for a well-to-do family in Pelham, New York. I have to confess, this is the first time I have ever written to a gentleman in this way, so please forgive me if I seem a little uncertain of what to say. Cook told me I should explain how I might be suitable for what you hope for in a wife, although I know that seems rather forward. I am 21 years old, the youngest of 5 sisters, but only 2 remain nearby. I am of humble origins, and people tell me I'm well-mannered and like to see the best in people. I am used to hard work as I have been a housemaid for many years. My mistress sometimes commends me for doing well when I serve her guests, and I am used to turning my hand to many different tasks in the home, so I hope that will stand me in good stead. I help Mrs. Batchley with the cooking when her arthritis is playing up, so I can turn my hand to cooking too, for plain fare and more fancy occasions. I expect you might like to know why I would consider traveling so far away. It is a little complicated. But without going into too much detail, I was let down by someone, and it made me realize I might find a more favorable future out west. One of my sisters is a mail-order bride with a very fine gentleman in California. Also, my previous mistress found happiness with a rancher who she met the same way, and as it happens, she lives near Griffin Creek, which is why your advertisement caught my eye. Both of them speak highly of being happily married this way. So, although I wouldn't want to be too forward or pressure you in any way with my first letter, I believe this might answer any questions you might have about why I'm writing. As well as the fact that you live in Griffin Creek, I was most taken with how close you sound to your family and how you describe enjoying the way your business plays a big part in your community. Being able to help those less fortunate and provide a pleasing meeting place for the folks who live around you sounds like a wonderfully settled way to live, which appeals greatly to me. I hope my letter finds you quickly and goes some way towards taking your interest. If you feel so inclined, I very much hope to hear from you soon. I'm sure you might have plenty of replies, but I put my faith in the Lord that if He thinks we should correspond more, you might favor my reply as much as any other. Yours sincerely, Doris. Levi leaned back on the bench and crossed one booted foot over the other, shaking his head with a low chuckle. Well, ain't I done well? She sounds like quite the perfect sort of wife that Aunt Maud would approve of. The Lord must have been smiling on me when you wrote that advertisement, James. He slapped his brother on the shoulder, chuckling again. But you'll need to know a lot more about her, surely? Always the more cautious of the two, James folded the letter up with a frown. This person who let her down, for example. Hadn't you better find out what happened? And don't you want to know more about whether she has the same sort of outlook on life as you? It won't do any good trying to please Aunt Maud without considering these matters, Levi. Getting married is an important decision. Levi stood up and stretched, with a self-satisfied smile on his face. I ain't got the time or the inclination to be poring over a desk, scratching away with a pen about all sorts of nonsense. If you think it's so important to find out more, why don't you write the letters for me? If it was down to me, I'd just as likely settle it with the toss of a coin, and if it landed heads up, send a proposal straight away. But I don't suppose you'd agree? He laughed at his brother's horrified expression as he sauntered away. I don't think that would be a good idea. It would feel kinda dishonest, don't you think? James realized his question had gone unheard as the cabin door swung closed behind Levi's retreating figure. He huffed with exasperation and sat back down on the bench, rereading the letter from Doris. Levi had always had an impulsive streak, preferring to take action and then figure out the finer details later, if at all, and James wondered if that was why Aunt Maud was trying to get him to settle down. He could sense that Levi had been feeling shackled by his duties lately, muttering under his breath about wanting to travel and see the world one minute, then grumbling that he wanted to get hitched and have a family the next, usually when he thought nobody was listening. James sat back on the bench and looked up at the darkening sky where the first stars were just coming into view like pale pinpricks in the vast indigo firmament. He felt his heart swell with gratitude for his uncomplicated life. Running the tea room with his friends and family nearby was everything he wanted. He had started to hope that a wife would complete his happiness when the Lord saw fit to bring one into his life, but other than that, he was perfectly content with his lot. His thoughts drifted back to the letter and Doris Haggerty. He wondered why she had been let down. Had it been a situation of her making, or was the other person in question at fault? Did she really like the sound of a quiet life in Griffin Creek, or was she just looking for an easy escape? Was she honest, the person she portrayed herself to be? There were so many questions swirling in his mind that he decided he would have to do Levi's bidding and write back on his behalf. If he let Levi do things his way, Doris Haggerty would be on the next train out west, with no idea about what Levi was really like. And more importantly, they would be taking a woman they scarcely knew into the heart of their family and business. As much as Levi had his faults and should have been doing his own courting, James knew he would have to be more cautious and get to know Doris as though he was Levi if there was to be any chance of a successful proposal and marriage for his brother ahead. Chapter 8. Pelham, New York. Doris smiled as she stood up from scooping up the ash from the fireplace in the nursery next to Mrs. Ricci's bedroom. Even though it was not her favorite chore, it gave her the chance to spend a few moments with her mistress's new baby. Gloria gave a gummy yawn as Doris peeked into the crib, blinking with the unfocused gaze of a newborn, and Doris felt her heart swell with the urge to pick her up, even though she knew the wet nurse would thoroughly disapprove. "Good morning, sweet one," Doris whispered quietly. She risked a stroke of Gloria's soft cheek with the tip of her finger, making sure there was no soot on her hands first. "Aren't you the most delightful baby?" she cooed quietly. Although her sisters had always told her that Doris was the least maternal one of them, she realized that it was far from true. It was just that she had never really had the opportunity to help with their babies as she had always been living at the Ricci's house. But now that she had seen baby Gloria almost since the day she had been born, Doris finally understood what a blessing it would be to have a family of her own. She hummed quietly as she let herself out of the nursery, swinging the ash bucket as she hurried down the stairs. The reason she was feeling so cheerful was not only because of Gloria. She had received a handful of letters from Mr. Bryant now. The first one had been fairly businesslike, telling her a little about Griffin Creek and his general store, and asking for a bit more information about her. She had sent a short reply back, thinking that if she said too much, she might make him regret his decision to correspond with her. Since then, several more had arrived, each capturing her imagination more than the last one. She knew she was no fancy wordsmith, and dreaded that his letters might suddenly stop once he realized. So when another letter had arrived a couple of days ago, she had been surprised and delighted. In the privacy of her small bedroom in the attic, she had closed her eyes and prayed. Dear Lord, please let Mr. Bryant have enjoyed my letters and want to continue our correspondence. And please let him be an honest and kindly gentleman. I put my trust in you, dear Lord, to know what is right for me. Even though I can scarcely imagine marrying a man I've never met, Piers showed me that even knowing someone isn't always a guarantee of happiness, and I'm scared I might make the same mistake again. In your graciousness, Lord, please guide me to see whether Mr. Bryant is a good man and help me know if we might be happy together. She had opened her eyes just as a soft ray of evening sunlight had fallen on the letter where she had laid it on her patchwork quilt, making her smile with relief. It was almost as if God had been giving her a sign, and she had opened the envelope with a sense of excitement, eager to read the contents. My dear Miss Haggerty, thank you for your last letter. I do worry that you might find my questions intrusive, so I'm always delighted when the postmaster brings news from you. I saved your last one until after we had all had dinner, as I was looking forward to hearing more about you and your life. It was the bright spot of my day, I have to say. You told me a little about yourself, but I must admit it only makes me want to know more. It made me feel like being given a glimpse of a lovely view and knowing that if I got closer, I would be able to see every beautiful detail. I wonder about the color of your hair and eyes. But more than your looks, I find myself thinking about what season is your favorite. What flower would you want to pick and pin on your dress? I would like to know what makes you smile and how you would like to take your coffee if we were sitting together watching the sunset on the veranda. I know that if I ask more questions of you, it's only fair to tell you more about my own situation in return. I guess I should start from the beginning. I took over the family business, Bryant's General Store, when our parents died some years back. I live with my younger brother James and my sister Lily. Our Aunt Maud took care of us for a while, and she still lives here with us. We all live in the cabin at the back of the business, which suits us well. I hope you wouldn't find it overwhelming to have a close-knit family around you. We all play our part, which is often how things are out west, whether it's on ranches or in town. Folks have to help each other out to get on here. James runs a tea room next door, and Lily helps between the general store and the tea room when she's not helping Aunt Maud keep house. I have been accused of being plain-spoken, but I don't see that as a bad thing. There's often a lot on my mind with running the business, but I'm not a mean person, and I would never lay a hand on a woman, unlike some men. We live a simple life in Griffin Creek, even with the demands of running our business. It might not appeal to everyone, but it suits us. I believe that honesty and kindness are essential to a happy marriage, and I try to live by these virtues myself. I'm confident that if you feel the same way, you wouldn't mind helping with some of the chores and fitting into family life. I don't have too many friends, as I'm often busy with work, but the idea of a quiet night sitting with the woman I love is very appealing. I hope to hear back from you again soon, Doris. You say you're not good with fancy words, but I disagree. I have read your last letter so many times already. I practically know it word for word, and hearing from you again will be something I very much look forward to. Yours sincerely, Levi Bryant. Doris could feel the rustle of paper in her apron pocket as she emptied the ash bucket. She had carried the letter with her from the moment she had opened the envelope. It had filled her with so much joy. Pausing outside the kitchen, she pulled it out again and pressed it to her chest, blinking back tears of happiness. The way Levi described his situation sounded perfect to her. She realized that although she had Cook and Wendy as her friends in Pelham, there was little else to keep her here. And the longer she stayed working as a housemaid, the more likely it was she would end up a spinster, just as her sisters had told her might happen. Levi sounded like a kind, fair man. The fact that he had been thrown into the role of caring for his family showed that he was the type of man who would respect his wife. And he had already hinted that he wanted to raise a family in a happy marriage. She had grown weary of the constant barbed comments from Mrs Ricci about how useless she was, and the last of her sisters had just moved away, so she had no family left in Pelham anymore. It touched her that Levi thought she might find Griffin Creek too quiet. In fact, she yearned for the sort of close community he had described. And she didn't mind working from dawn until dusk, or even longer if it meant she could be with someone she loved so they could raise a family and grow old together. For the first time since Piers had dazzled her with his smile that day he had arrived, she could see it had all been hollow charm, and his only intent had been to try and seduce her without a thought for her reputation. She was glad he was out of her life. And now, with Levi's letters, she felt herself beginning to find hope in her heart again. Levi was the sort of man she had always yearned for, and she came to a sudden decision. She would use her savings to have a photograph taken to send to him. The last time she had seen Piers, he had looked at her with an expression of disappointment, and she was determined not to have the same thing happen again. If Levi still proposed, having seen what she looked like, she would know it was for the right reasons. She would send the picture with her next letter and put her faith in the Lord that Levi would not mind a plain-looking wife. Chapter 9. Griffin Creek, Oregon. It's another special day for you, Levi. James put 2 mugs of coffee down as he greeted his brother out on the veranda. They had closed the store an hour ago, and he could hear Aunt Maud and Lily chatting in the kitchen, interspersed with the occasional burst of laughter as they prepared dinner. Special, huh? Felt more like another day of grind and toil in the store, if you ask me. What are you yammering on about? James, I don't have the patience for your riddles tonight. Levi stomped over from the shed where he had been sawing and hammering for the last few evenings, making more shelves for the store. Lily had informed him that he was missing a trick by not selling more hair ribbons and trinkets to appeal to women coming from the East Coast to settle, so he had reluctantly agreed to make a small display ready for when the traveling salesman next called. The postmaster delivered another letter for you. Sit down and have a coffee while you read it. Levi kicked off his boots and took a noisy slurp of the drink, with little more than a twitch of his eyebrow as he eyed the envelope lying on the table in front of him. The sloping handwriting was familiar to both of them now. When James had seen it earlier, he had felt a thrill of anticipation. But it seemed as though Levi was either playing it cool or was too tired to care much. What's she got to say for herself this time? Levi mumbled as he gulped down another swig of his coffee. His eyes darted in the opposite direction as he heard the rowdy shouts of a group of men on the street, heading to the saloon, no doubt. He hoped dinner would be ready soon so he could join them later, as soon as Aunt Maud was safely out of the way, tucked up in bed. I haven't read it, James shot back. As much as he'd wanted to rip the letter open the moment it had been delivered, he'd exercised restraint. It was Levi's courtship, after all, even though he wasn't making much of an effort. Well, go on, then. Levi yawned and scratched his head. The buxom maid who helped at the saloon had flirted with him 2 nights ago and had been on his mind ever since. He sat down and rearranged his face into an interested expression to keep James happy. It feels thicker than usual. Levi opened the letter, and his eyes widened with surprise as a black and white photograph slipped out from the folded letter. He picked it up and angled it toward the soft light from the lamp next to him, and his heart skipped a beat. He hadn't really known what to expect of her looks, but his first impression was that Doris was not what he had imagined. She had soft curls that framed her oval face and large eyes with a gaze that looked straight at the camera. Her mouth was not what he'd call a rosebud shape, but it was generous, and where her lips were slightly parted, He could see that she had a small gap between her front teeth. She had said in her last letter that she was not a natural beauty, but to him, there was a frankness about her expression that was down to earth. And he noticed the hint of dimples in her cheeks that made him believe she was always ready with a warm smile. "Let me see, then." Levi snatched the picture from his hand, carelessly crumpling the corner. He gave the image a long look, noticing that her dress was primly edged with a lace collar right up to her neck, and the way the dark folds of fabric hid her feminine curves. He pursed his lips slightly and dropped the picture onto the table. "She ain't bad looking, I guess," he said thoughtfully. "Put her in a pretty lower-cut dress, and I reckon she could be a proper looker, enough to turn a few heads when she's on my arm. You did all right for me there, James. I owe you one." Brightening, he slapped his knee and jumped up from the bench. "I'm going in for dinner. I'm hungry enough to eat a horse. Then I'll be out for a few hours, but don't tell Aunt Maud." He winked and smirked in James's direction. James cringed and felt a surge of annoyance at how crass his brother was being and the way he always assumed he would do whatever he asked. He picked the photograph up again and carefully smoothed the corner flat. "What about the letter from Doris? You haven't read that yet." "No need," Levi said blithely. "Write back to her tonight with a proposal. She'll do me just fine." "So soon?" James asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. "You've only been corresponding a couple of months, and if I'm not mistaken, you're still messing around with the girls at the saloon." Levi spun around and strode back, his eyes narrow with anger. "You listen to me, James. I ain't bein' told what to do by a glorified cook, even if you are my little brother." His words were barbed with sarcasm as his temper got the better of him. "Aunt Maud said she wanted me to settle down, and we both know she ain't getting any younger. In fact, she's been looking kind of frail recently, so I need to get this inheritance sorted out quick sharp. Otherwise, we might end up being left with nothing." In his typical mercurial fashion, Levi's mood brightened again as quickly as it had darkened, and he stuck his hands in his pockets and started sauntering away. "Doris Haggerty is the woman who will finally capture the heart of Griffin Creek's most eligible bachelor, James," he chuckled. "Send her a nice proposal, won't you? We don't want to scare her off at the last minute." "Are you sure you don't want longer to think about it, Levi? I'm happy to write a few more letters so you can get to know Doris better." "Nope. My mind is made up. I'll be the perfect gentleman once she's here. So don't worry your head about those women at the saloon. They're nothing more than a pleasant distraction. Doris and I will have a lifetime to get to know each other, so we may as well get married as soon as she can get here." Levi dug in his pocket and pulled out some money, slapping it onto the table. "Send her the fare for her railroad journey with it so she knows I'm serious." James shook his head once he was alone again. He knew that much of Levi's demeanor was because he'd had to grow up so fast when their parents had died. He loved him dearly, but boy, he tried his patience sorely sometimes. "If it was down to me, I would have given you more time to make sure it's what you wanted, Doris," he murmured quietly to himself as he picked up the unread letter. He put Levi's domineering demands to one side and started to read, a smile lifting the corners of his mouth as he enjoyed her words. Doris was chattier this time, telling him more about the family she worked for and the delightful new baby her mistress had just had. Now that James knew what she looked like, he could almost picture her bustling about her chores in the grand brownstone house and sneaking into the nursery to give little Gloria a cuddle. His heart warmed at how motherly she sounded, and he chuckled as she described the antics of her 4 older sisters. Settling down an hour later with pen and paper to write the letter of proposal, James tussled with mixed emotions as he glanced for the 100th time at her photograph. He couldn't help but smile as he realized he had already committed every line of her warm, open expression to his memory. On the one hand, sending a heartfelt proposal felt like the most natural thing in the world. But on the other hand, something was holding him back. He hesitated with his pen poised over the paper, not ready to continue. Like a punch to the gut, James suddenly realized what was troubling him. He wanted to write the proposal all right, but for himself, not for Levi. He chewed his lip and put the pen down before picking it up again. It was no good. He had agreed to do all the letters on Levi's behalf, so he could hardly back out now that his brother was actually ready to take the most important step. He would just have to put his own feelings for Doris aside, no matter how hard it would be. He sighed at the unfamiliar feelings that were coursing through him. All his life, he had looked up to Levi and been happy to play second fiddle to his charismatic brother. He had never once felt jealous or acted selfishly for his own ends, grateful that they were such a close-knit family in spite of losing their parents too soon. But for the first time, he wanted something that belonged to Levi. He sighed noisily and grimaced. The irony was that Doris had no idea it was his own hopes and dreams he had shared in the letters. And where he had written more specifically about Levi, he had done such a good job of showing him in a good light that there was no reason why Doris wouldn't want to say yes to him. "It's a real pickle, ain't it?" he muttered to himself. "Are you coming in for dinner or talking to yourself all night?" Lily's head popped through the door, and she grinned at him. "What's that you're doing anyway?" "Yes, coming now. It's nothing, just helping Levi out with something he can't be bothered to do himself." James tidied the pen and paper away, wishing he could share his troubles with his younger sister. But it was between him and Levi, and he decided to let the matter pass. He was sure that once Levi and Doris started courting properly and had a quick marriage, as was common with mail-order brides, he would be able to rein in his own emotions and be happy for them both. Nobody need ever know that by posing as his brother, James had started to fall in love with the woman Levi would be marrying. He just had to make sure that it stayed that way. Chapter 10. Pelham, New York. In her wildest dreams, Doris had never imagined that she might feel herself falling in love through letters alone. It was only because her old mistress, Sophia, had encouraged her to brush up on her reading and writing skills that she had been brave enough to even attempt becoming a mail-order bride, with all the correspondence it entailed. She was thrilled that Levi had written back to her almost by return of post, after each of her letters. Even though she had never even seen pictures of Oregon, if she closed her eyes, she could almost picture the majestic mountains and rippling blue rivers and lakes that Levi described surrounding their frontier town. The way he spoke of some of their customers, and the pleasure of the first tinkle of the door opening as they arrived to do their shopping or to dine at the tea room, filled her with happiness as she tried to imagine herself there with him, welcoming customers and becoming part of Griffin Creek's community. After being in service for as long as she could remember, it sounded like her idea of heaven. Several weeks after sending her photograph, Doris was still on tenterhooks about the bold move. When she had looked in the mirror before having it taken, she had seen only mousy brown hair compared to her sisters, who all had golden curls, and her hazel eyes seemed boring compared to their sparkling green ones. She desperately hoped Levi wouldn't have been put off by the picture, but all she could do was wait and hope. Now that she had taken the plunge, she prayed every night that a proposal might come soon. But she knew such things couldn't be rushed. "Cook said lunch is ready, Doris." Wendy sniffed loudly as she pushed the parlor door open, carrying a heavy bucket of coal to lay the fire. "And I almost forgot, the postboy delivered a letter for you." She grinned as she saw Doris's face light up with anticipation. "When I'm older, I'm going to write for a husband too." She clattered the bucket on the hearth before adding that she would need to get Cook to help her learn to read and write first. Doris picked up her duster and furniture polish and hurried to the kitchen, grabbing the letter off the dresser. Cook was busy outside, scolding the boy who ran errands for them for dropping some eggs, so she decided to read it straight away instead of waiting until she was in her bedroom. "My dearest Doris, I hope you don't think me too forward for using such an endearment, but it's the first thing that springs to mind when I think of you. It was such a delightful surprise to receive your photograph. I had imagined you to have kind eyes and a warm expression, but nothing could have compared to how beautiful you really are, Doris. You must light up every room you enter, and I can only be grateful that some other gentleman hasn't already married you, because the thought of never hearing from you again makes me feel quite alarmed. As for the person who let you down, although you haven't said much about that, if it was a man, he must have been out of his mind to treat you that way. I know it might feel as though we haven't been writing to each other for long, but I have read your letters over and over. I realized that I have fallen in love with you, Doris. I hope you won't think me a fool for saying it so soon, but I can't let it remain unsaid, and I declare that every part of me can see us spending our future together. To see the turn of the seasons and raise a family with you is everything I desire. It is with great hope that I want to ask if you will travel to Griffin Creek for us to be together, Doris. I wish to ask for your hand in marriage and for us to be wed by the local pastor, where I can vow to protect and love you in front of my family and friends in the eyes of the Lord. I feel certain that even though we might face some challenges when you arrive, because of never having met, our letters have shown me that we are well suited. I believe we can overcome anything, Doris, if we agree to compromise, and remember that love is something that we can choose each day if we're to be together. I have enclosed some money for your railroad fare and other travel costs, and I wholeheartedly hope that your next letter will be an acceptance of my proposal and a date in the very near future when I can meet you at the train station and welcome you to Griffin Creek. My dear Doris, I want you to know how happy your letters have made me. My future is in your hands now, but I very much hope we will cherish each other and grow old together. Yours sincerely, Levi. Doris could scarcely breathe for the emotion that overwhelmed her, and she dabbed her handkerchief on her eyes as she realized they had filled with unexpected tears. It was quite the most romantic moment of her life, and she found herself laughing and crying at the same time as she realized that Levi had chosen her and asked for her hand in marriage. "What on earth is going on, dearie? Are you all right?" Mrs. Batchley's face was by turns alarmed and then perplexed as she bustled back into the kitchen. "I'm going to be married," Doris said happily, dashing the last of her tears away. "Levi has sent a letter of proposal, Enid. I can scarcely believe it." Mrs. Batchley clapped her hands together with delight and then threw her arms around Doris's waist, twirling her around the room. "Oh my goodness," she gasped. "I'm so happy for you, dearie. It couldn't have happened to a nicer person, and Levi Bryant will be a very lucky man to call you his wife." She gave Doris one more hug, but suddenly, her face clouded with worry, and she stepped away, holding her at arm's length. "What is it?" Doris asked, looking confused. "Do you think it's a mistake for me to accept?" Mrs. Batchley glanced down and then gave her a searching look. "I don't know quite how to say this without risking that you might take offense. Are you in the family way, Doris? Your dress feels tight and you seem breathless." Doris started to shake her head vehemently. "No, Enid, I can't be." She stopped abruptly, and her eyes filled with tears again. But this time, there was no laughter to accompany them. Her mouth trembled, and she hung her head in shame. "I think Mr. Wallace took advantage of me. After the party, he told me the fruit punch had no liquor in it. But when I woke up the following morning, I couldn't remember anything about the night, except that he helped me upstairs to my bedroom." Her confession came out as a ragged whisper as the full horror of her predicament hit her. Mrs. Batchley's mouth tightened into a thin line. "That man is evil," she muttered. "I thought it was bad enough that he was a thief, but to have taken your virtue as well, and left you in the family way and all alone, he deserves to rot in jail for the rest of his days." Tears rolled down Doris's cheeks as she waited for her friend to chastise her for being such a gullible fool. "I've ruined my chances of marrying Levi before I've even accepted his proposal," she sobbed. "Who would want to marry me now that I'm expecting a child? How could Piers have done this to me and then just abandoned me without a second thought?" A sudden swish of silk announced Mrs. Ricci in the doorway, and she marched up to Doris with a face like thunder. "Did I hear correctly, Miss Haggerty, that you are with child, and to that odious thief, Mr. Wallace?" Her eyes glittered with anger, and 2 spots of red colored her cheeks. "Answer me, girl. Don't just stand there gawping like a fish." "It ain't her fault," Mrs. Batchley started, but Mrs. Ricci held up her hand imperiously to silence her. Doris nodded slowly, feeling her legs starting to tremble. Her day was turning from a wonderful dream into some sort of terrible nightmare. I believe I am with child, Mrs. Ricci, she croaked. It was an accident. I didn't even know anything had happened. Mrs. Ricci folded her arms, looking even angrier. You must leave my employment by the end of the week, Miss Haggerty. I've got a good mind to report you to the police for immoral behavior. With one final glare at both of them, she turned heel and stalked back out, leaving Doris in stunned silence. What is it? What did I miss? Wendy barged into the kitchen moments later, looking intrigued. The mistress is in a high old temper. I ain't never seen her looking so angry. Doris sighed, feeling suddenly exhausted by it all. I'm with child, Wendy, and I have to leave here by the end of the week, she said flatly. 10 minutes ago, I thought all my dreams were coming true and I would be heading west to marry Mr. Bryant. But now I'm homeless and in the family way without even knowing it had happened. I shall have to send a letter to Levi to tell him I won't be coming after all. She squared her shoulders, determined not to feel sorry for herself. Wait a minute. Let's not be too hasty. Cook interjected. She pulled a chair out for Doris to sit down and poured her a glass of lemonade to bring some color back to her cheeks. From everything you've told us, it sounds like Levi Bryant is a kind-hearted, God-fearing man. He is, Doris said wistfully. She thought back to the letters and how gentlemanly and caring he seemed to be. I think he would be the sort of man who wouldn't judge you harshly for such a mistake. Mrs. Batchley said, patting Doris's hand. Your baby will need a ma and a pa. Maybe Levi will be understanding enough to marry you regardless, Doris. It's not the baby's fault that Piers abandoned you. A happy marriage with Levi, so you can raise the baby together, could still be possible. Doris shook her head sadly. I told him that I'm an honest, hard-working woman, Cook. How could he possibly accept me if I lie to him? That's not what I'm suggesting at all. Mrs. Batchley nodded for Wendy to start serving the soup for their lunch. Remember that Miss Sophia said in one of her letters that there are lots of opportunities in Griffin Creek for work and marriage? You can't stay here, so why don't you travel west anyway? And then make sure you tell Levi everything as soon as you arrive. That way, he can't accuse you of being dishonest. I suppose I could. Doris sipped her lemonade, her thoughts spinning as she wrestled with her conscience. Maybe it would be better to let him know by letter first. Why don't you give him the opportunity to meet you in person, dearie? Mrs. Batchley reached for the plate of cornbread and passed some to Doris. She would need to keep her strength up if she had a long journey ahead. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Doris. All you can do is be honest with Levi when you meet him and tell him that if he doesn't want to pursue the marriage, you will get work and pay him back the train fare. A bright, capable woman like you will find a new job easily enough, and maybe Miss Sophia will help you. A fresh start is what you need, with or without Levi Bryant. Doris gave Mrs. Batchley a tentative smile, feeling slightly more optimistic. You're right, I can't stay in Pelham. Mrs. Ricci might spread gossip about me, and at least if I can meet Levi and talk to him face to face to explain, he might find it in his heart to understand and forgive me. I'll miss you, Doris, Wendy suddenly blurted out. You've been the best friend I could have had, helping me every time you could. I hope Levi marries you and you're happy together. Perhaps you could call the baby Wendy when she arrives? She asked with a cheeky smile. Doris looked at her and burst out laughing. I'll miss you both too, she said, feeling relieved that her friends hadn't turned against her. And I promise, if it's a girl, I'll name her Enid Wendy. How about that? Chapter 11. Griffin Creek, Oregon. James couldn't recall having such a jovial evening in their kitchen for a long time. The table was laden with as much food as a Christmas dinner, and the candlelight cast a soft glow on all the people seated around it. But it was Doris who he could barely drag his eyes from. She had described herself as having plain brown hair and eyes of a similar color. Instead, her chestnut curls fell softly about her oval face, and he could see hints of green in her hazel eyes when she shyly glanced up at him. He was completely smitten, and the thought of trying to put his feelings for her to one side felt almost impossibly difficult. He made a valiant effort to give his brother an encouraging smile, but he could see by the smug look on Levi's face that he needed no such help. He looked like the cat who had gotten the cream. Sitting at the head of the table, with his chest puffed out as though he was some sort of lord of the manor, James couldn't help but think. After finding out at the last minute that the pastor had decided to become a missionary overseas, and it would be at least 2 weeks for his replacement to arrive from California, it had been arranged that Doris would take the small room between Aunt Maud's and Lily's that was usually used as a storeroom and for sewing. James had felt a pang of guilt at how relieved he had felt when Levi had casually shared the fact that the wedding would have to be delayed. While everyone else tucked into a hearty helping of Aunt Maud's cold meat and pickles, James noticed that Doris had scarcely touched hers. "Aren't you hungry after your journey?" he asked quickly. "I've heard the food isn't very tasty at the stopping points on the railroad." Doris looked awkward for a moment, giving her hosts an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, I guess it's just tiredness. You're right, this food is far better than what I've had this last week." James felt a pang of guilt at the way he had drawn attention to her. He could tell that she was feeling overwhelmed by everything and could hardly blame her. He glanced at his brother, hoping Levi would say something to make her feel more welcome, but he was busy mounding more fried potatoes onto his plate, not seeming to notice Doris's discomfort. "I should think you must be exhausted," Lily said kindly. "I can't even imagine being stuck on a bumpy train for a whole week with everyone else's noise and bother all around you." "It wasn't so bad. Most of the other ladies were very friendly," Doris murmured. "At least you've arrived in good time to get settled in before the summer fair. It's the most fun time we have all year, isn't it, Levi?" Lily nudged her brother, trying to draw him into the conversation. She had never known him so quiet, and James wasn't being much better. It was as if they'd never seen a pretty young woman before, she thought to herself with an inward chuckle. "I wouldn't say that," Levi said gruffly. "It's a lot of hard work in the general store, but at least it helps get some money in ahead of winter." "I enjoy it," James said as he saw an anxious look cross Doris's eyes. "Don't let Levi make you think it's all about work, Doris. Sure, it's a busy week beforehand, but it's fun. We serve special cakes in the tea room, and then there are stalls and entertainment in the park after we close. It's a nice chance for everyone to get together." "I guess you would have had something much grander in Pelham?" Lily asked, eager to hear more about life in the East. "Yes, they did have fairs and circuses which my mistress used to go to, but it wasn't something she encouraged her maids to do." "Too much flirting from the visiting showman, I expect," Levi said with a salacious grin. "Plenty of that goes on at our summer fair too, I can tell you. But don't worry, I won't let any of the rough folks bother you, Doris." He gave her a sly wink. "When they know you're my fiancée, the only sort of looks you'll be getting are envious ones." James winced at the coarseness of his brother's comment when he saw the flush creeping over Doris's cheeks. He sensed that she wasn't the sort of woman who appreciated lewd talk. Levi would have known that too if he'd taken the time to read her letters, and he wished he had forced him to pay more attention. "I hope you ain't going to expect too much fancy treatment," Levi continued. He chewed his meal loudly, talking with his mouth full, and then gulped a mouthful of water as if he was in a hurry to be elsewhere. "You know what they say, once a couple is wed, the chase is over. But I'm so busy with running this place, we can consider the chase is already done, huh? No need to bother ourselves with all that lovey-dovey courting that other folks get so caught up in. Silly fools." He guffawed with laughter at his own joke and then shoved another large forkful of potato in his mouth, looking very pleased with himself. Doris gave a small nod and took a sip of water with a puzzled look on her face. James wished he could snatch Levi's words back and replace them with something gentle and romantic that would cause her dimples to appear with a happy smile instead of the confusion that clouded her eyes. "We are so delighted you're here, my dear," Maud said, smoothing over the awkward moment. "Levi kept your arrival pretty close to his chest, though. We only found out a few days ago that he had proposed, so you'll have to excuse the fact that my sewing supplies are still in your room. I don't do much of it any longer. My eyesight isn't as good as it used to be." "I love to sew," Doris said, giving Maud a grateful smile. "Not that I had much time. what with all my chores and having to be on call for Mrs. Ricci and the family. I expect you'll enjoy being able to do more now then. In fact, why don't you help yourself to my sewing things? I have all sorts of buttons and bits of lace which could be put to good use, and it would make me very happy to see you do something with them. We could sew a new dress each for the summer fair, Lily said happily. It's like I've gotten a new sister, she added, patting Doris's hand. All these years I've had to listen to Levi and James talking about the business, and now you're here. Things are going to be much better. James felt a surge of affection for Lily and Aunt Maud as he saw Doris start to relax. He wished he could do more himself, but he was worried that it might look strange if he was more attentive toward her than Levi. He would have put a posy of flowers on her nightstand and perhaps offered her some hot chocolate at bedtime to make her feel more relaxed. He tried not to sigh out loud as he suddenly realized that his thoughts were leading him down a dangerous path. The rest of the meal passed more easily as Lily chattered about life in Griffin Creek, but as soon as the dishes had been washed, Doris excused herself. Her face was pale with tiredness, and James's heart went out to her as he sat next to the window to flick through his recipe book. A short while afterward, Lily and Maud turned down the lamps in the kitchen and turned in to bed themselves as well, leaving the men to lock up. You could have done more to help her settle in, Levi. What was all that business about saying that courting is just for silly fools? James demanded in a low voice. She's not some sort of item on a list, just to be checked off and then on to the next. It ain't none of your business, little brother, Levi replied easily. I don't want her thinking I'm some sort of pushover, jumping at her every wish. He rolled his eyes as he reached for his hat. I'm setting the ground rules for our marriage, is all. She has to fit into how I run things around here, else we'll be in for all sorts of trouble. James gave Levi a hard stare. His brother was starting to sound more and more like the rough-drinking gold prospectors he had been keeping company with at the saloon, and he felt a fresh wave of irritation at how casually he was treating this whole situation. Going out, are you? He asked sarcastically as he watched Levi heading for the door. Uh-huh. The women are tucked up asleep, and I've got unfinished business. Levi didn't bother to explain what it was and hurried away. James wandered out onto the veranda, suddenly feeling stifled by the warmth inside and the turmoil of his thoughts. He leaned back in his old wooden chair and rested his ankles on the veranda rail, looking up at the inky starlit sky for some sort of answer to his worries. He had accepted that it might feel awkward seeing Doris and Levi's courtship and marriage blossom while they were all under the same roof. But nothing had prepared him for Levi's casual disregard for her, as if she was just another asset to his name instead of a woman to love and treasure. He waited until quietness had fallen and closed his eyes to pray. Dear Lord, please forgive me for causing all this mess by pretending to be Levi in the letters. It was done with good intentions, but I didn't think it through. And please forgive me for wishing that Doris was marrying me instead of Levi. I know she's come here to be with him, and I have to put my feelings of protectiveness and affection for her aside. Otherwise, it will only cause trouble for the family I love. He sighed again and stood up to turn in for the night before pausing to add one final piece to his prayer. Lord, please bring Doris happiness. I think she's troubled by something, and she deserves love and security. Please bless her with your graciousness. Amen. He paused for a moment, enjoying the scent of the flowers in the garden on the soft night air, pushing down the unbidden thought that he would like to share such moments with Doris. It was in God's hands now. All he could hope was that Levi would treat her well and that they loved each other. As for him, he would just have to try harder to quell his wayward feelings, because the last thing he wanted was to cause a rift with his brother. Chapter 12. Doris stretched and yawned as she swung her legs out from under the covers. It was still not quite light, but she had woken early out of habit. In her old life, she would have hurried straight to the kitchen to start her many chores of the day at Mrs. Ricci's command, and it felt strange not to have those constraints anymore. She slipped one of her plain work dresses over her head and coiled her hair into a bun before pinching her cheeks to stop herself from looking so pale. "I'm going to have to tell them today," she whispered to herself, looking down at the slight swell of her belly beneath her apron. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed, but Doris had already let out the seams of her dress to accommodate her new shape. And it would only be a matter of time before it became obvious that she was expecting a baby. She allowed herself the luxury of a moment to daydream about holding the baby in her arms, almost able to imagine the sweet smell that was unique to a newborn. She could hardly wait. She peered into the mirror that hung above a small chest of drawers that had been cleared for her, wondering whether her secret was etched on her features for all to see. The trouble was that even after just one night, she didn't want to leave the Bryant family home. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so welcomed, by everyone other than Levi at least. Maud seemed wise and kind, reminding her of Mrs. Batchley, and Lily's bubbly personality was charming, especially the way she had been so excited about her arrival. It made Doris feel better about missing her sisters, that was for sure. And then there was James. Doris sat back on the edge of the bed for a moment to try and make sense of him. If she was being honest with herself, she couldn't quite put her finger on how she felt about him. When he looked at her, it was with a sort of intensity that she had never experienced before, as if he could see into her soul. At first, she had found it disconcerting, but her heart seemed to have a will of its own, skipping a beat under the inquiring gaze of his dark blue eyes every time he glanced in her direction. It was as if he had hidden depths, and she wondered what he was thinking behind his calm demeanor. By comparison, Levi seemed far more straightforward, much to her relief, although he wasn't at all what she had expected from his letters. He reminded her of the swaggering men at Pelham Market, hawking their wares, where the loudest, brashest of them sold the most. She had expected him to be more romantic and had felt hurt by his comment that courting was for fools. Give the poor man a chance. The thought brought a wry smile to her mouth. Standing up again to get on with the day, she reminded herself that although Levi seemed rougher and more brusque than she had imagined he would be, his letters had shown a gentler side, which would no doubt come out as they got better acquainted. "What would you like me to do today, Levi?" Doris smoothed down her apron and gave him a shy smile as she slipped into the general store through the back door, which was just across the way from the family home. "Would you like to tell me about what you sell, so I can deal with any customers that come in?" "Huh?" Levi looked distracted as he heaved a fresh sack of flour into its spot near the bags of dried fruit and jars of spices. Swiping a knife through the twine that held it tightly closed, he ripped the sack open and folded it open. "Wretched customers. I had one. Mrs. Johnson complained that our flour was full of mites, even though everyone knows she tries it on with all the storekeepers." His mouth twisted with irritation. "I had to throw out a perfectly good sack of flour, else she would have spread her evil gossip far and wide." "It's a good thing you get on with most of your customers," Doris said quickly, trying to cheer him up. "I like the way you said you enjoy being part of this community." Levi looked at her blankly and then shook his head slightly, as though she'd said something strange. "I liked your idea of arranging ingredients together for recipe ideas," Doris continued, referring to something Levi had put in his letters. "Even the best stores in Pelham hadn't thought of something that smart." "Oh, don't give Levi the credit for that," Lily said teasingly as she breezed in behind them. "James is the brains behind most of the good ideas when it comes to how to tempt our customers to buy more." She grinned at Levi, who had scowled at her comment. "Don't be grumpy, Levi. You should give James more credit. Look at how popular the tea room is, and that was all his idea." "All right, Lily," Levi snapped. "Just remember who brought you up and kept the roof over our heads when Ma and Pa died, won't you?" Doris busied herself with arranging the bolts of brightly colored cloth and bobbins of cotton so they looked more orderly, not wanting to get sucked into a family row. Lily's comments surprised her because, from Levi's letters, it had sounded like James's tea room was little more than a side business to give him something to do and bring a few dollars in. She wondered why he had misrepresented it when it sounded like a thriving enterprise. Lily tossed her head and marched off, saying she was going to start preparing a stew for their dinner, leaving Doris and Levi alone again. "Watch what you're doing there," Levi barked. He strode over and returned the arrangements of fabrics to how they had been before. "There's no need to go changing things just for the sake of it, Doris. I ain't spent over 10 years in this store getting it just how I like it for nothing, you know." He shot her a look that made her step back apologetically. "We don't need your fancy ideas from the city here, you know," he added with a chuckle. I'm sorry, I was just trying to help." His words stung, and Doris waited for the gentle reassurance that she felt sure he would give her. But Levi just sighed and climbed up the ladder to get some soap down from the top shelf. "All of this is a bit strange for both of us, I guess," she added lightly. "Uh-huh. This has been my life for as long as I can remember," Levi muttered above her. "Tell you what, why don't you go and help Lily in the house? Ain't no need for you to be getting under my feet here in the store." Doris couldn't decide whether the way Levi had dismissed her was a blessing or a curse as she went to join Lily in the kitchen. It gave her a bit more time to figure out how she was going to tell him about her being in the family way, but she hadn't expected to feel quite so shunned. It was almost as if he didn't even want her here, which made no sense to her at all. "Don't worry about Levi's moods," Lily said as she handed Doris a knife so they could peel apples together. "He's always been the hot-headed one of the family. Aunt Maud tells him to mind his manners, but it's just the way he is." She seemed unperturbed by the way Levi had scolded her earlier, giving Doris a friendly smile. "I suppose it must have been a big responsibility, taking everything on after you lost your parents." Lily nodded. "Yes, I reckon so. But being in charge suits Levi down to the ground. I love him as much as anyone, but he sure does like bossing us all around. I don't reckon anyone will ever dare come courtin' with me until he stops thinking I'm still a little girl." She sighed with exasperation, but Doris could see how fond Lily was of her brothers. "James and Levi seem very different. Do they get on well?" Doris wanted to find out more about the family, and Lily seemed happy to chat. "Like chalk and cheese," Lily replied with a giggle. "To be honest, I'm surprised James hasn't gotten married already. He's had a few young ladies making eyes at him, but nobody's caught his fancy. He's a dreamer, you see, holding out for true love, he told me once." "That's not such a bad thing." Doris shivered suddenly at the memory of how Piers had proclaimed to be in love with her before brushing her hand unconsciously over her belly. She was determined not to let Piers's character flaws taint her love for her precious firstborn, no matter how difficult life might become for her. "Now, Levi is completely different," Lily continued, chattering happily as she warmed to her subject. "He's the sort of man who wants an adventure. I reckon he'd like nothing more than to up sticks and be a traveling salesman like the ones who come to the store to do business with him. He always seems kinda down when he watches them leave. And even better if he found an adventurous young lady who wanted to do the same too." Lily suddenly blushed as she realized what she'd said. "I mean, that's what he used to be like. But now that you're going to be his wife, I'm sure he'll enjoy staying in Griffin Creek. You'll be a steadying influence on him." Doris chuckled at the way Lily's tongue had run away with her. She was so bubbly that she barely took a breath between speaking. "Levi didn't really come across that way in his letters," Doris mused. "He sounded more as if he loved the thought of staying in one place and raising a family. From the little I've seen of Griffin Creek already, I can see why." "Are you nervous about getting married to someone you've only just met?" Lily asked. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity. Romance was her favorite topic of conversation, and it made a rare change to have someone almost her own age to talk about it with. "Not nervous. It's just," Doris sighed, not sure whether she should confide in Lily. She was Levi's sister, after all. "Just what? Are you having second thoughts?" "It's just, I suppose I expected to feel more in love with Levi." Doris clasped her hands to her chest over her heart. "I expected to arrive in Griffin Creek and feel like we were madly in love already. But now I'm afraid it's a terrible mistake," Lily finished for her. "Oh no, Doris, that's no good." her eyes clouded with worry on her new friend's behalf. "Why are you feeling that way? Levi can be a bit gruff, but he ain't a bad man. He'd never be mean to you." "It's not that I think he'd be mean," Doris said hastily. She wasn't doing a very good job of explaining herself, but she plowed on. "Have you ever seen someone do a magic trick?" "Sure have. The magician is always my favorite at the summer fair." "Exactly. I remember watching one in Pelham Market once. It was amazing, and nobody could figure out how he'd made the rabbit appear out of nowhere." "That's my favorite trick, too," Lily cried, clapping her hands together. Doris nodded quickly, wanting to make her point. "But after all the crowds had gone that one time, I saw him packing everything away, and I saw that he had a big pocket inside his jacket. It was like I'd believed one thing, and then found out it wasn't true." Lily chuckled as she sliced up one of the apples. "So you're saying Levi is like a disappointing rabbit, huh? I've heard him called many things, but not that." "No, I don't mean that," Doris said hastily, hoping she hadn't come across as ungrateful or rude. "It's just that in the letters he wrote me, Levi came across as so charming and thoughtful. The way he spoke about Griffin Creek and the land here, he sounded like he loved it here and enjoyed the part his store played in the community. His proposal was so heartfelt, and the way he spoke about how we would work together and raise a family, it made me cry." Lily's hands had stilled as she gave Doris her full attention. "I could almost cry myself. How romantic," she breathed. "But since I got here, I feel as though I'm in Levi's way. He didn't want my help in the store this morning, and it feels as though he doesn't even want my company or even to be in Griffin Creek either." Doris sighed. "I'm just feeling confused, I guess. I expected Levi to be somehow different because of what he shared of himself in his letters. But now that I've met him, it feels like he's someone completely different. I'm sure things will get easier in time. It's just a little confusing is all. His letters sounded so different from what he's like in person." Lily poured some water over the apples, lost in thought. "James has always had a good way with words. He must have gotten a bit carried away, I guess." Doris frowned and looked at Lily with confusion. "James? What do you mean?" Lily bit her lip, looking embarrassed. "Ignore that, Doris. I shouldn't have said anything." She darted a guilty glance at the door as if expecting to see Levi striding in. "I ain't completely sure, but I saw James writing letters a few times, and I know Levi ain't got the patience for that kind of thing. If the letters were full of romance, it sounds more like James's nature. I suppose he just asked James to help him out. Don't tell them, or I'll be in all sorts of trouble." Doris tried to smile as she felt her stomach clench with a swoop of tumultuous emotions. Suddenly, everything made sense. That was why her heart had skipped a beat when she looked at James, but felt nothing under Levi's casual gaze. It explained why James had kept trying to make her feel more welcome last night over dinner before retreating into silence again and glaring at his brother. She had fallen in love with James, the author of the letters, not Levi, the man to who she was promised and would be marrying in a few weeks. I'm not sure what to say about that." Lily gave her a pleading look. "Just give Levi a bit more time, Doris. He's a good man beneath his rough exterior, I promise. Y'all just need a chance to get to know each other is all. You'll soon love him once you get to know him better, I'm sure." Doris gulped and smiled before returning to her task as Lily hurried away to fetch some flour to start baking. Her head was spinning with 100 questions, and she felt the bile rise in her throat about how she had been deceived. Anger pulsed through her veins as she wondered how James could have agreed to such subterfuge. But then, as she felt the very first quickening of the baby in her belly, as delicate as the flutter of butterfly wings, she realized that she had come here under false pretenses as well. It seemed they all had secrets, and she would have to make her own confessions to the family before the day was out. Chapter 13. The next few days passed by in a blur of activity, with the whole Bryant family intent on getting ready for the summer fair. Every time Doris tried to pluck up the courage to ask Levi if they could talk alone, something would distract his attention, and he would hurry away. Meanwhile, James was quietly attentive, seeming to anticipate what Doris wanted even before she had fully realized it herself. Whether it was a fresh glass of water or a plumped-up cushion on her chair, His unassuming demeanor was kind and thoughtful, which made her swirling emotions even harder to keep in check. Part of her was still angry with him, yet she could feel herself being drawn to him in a way that was nothing like how she felt for Levi. Perhaps it's for the best that Levi and I don't seem to be well suited. He'll probably throw me out as soon as I tell him about the baby. The thought felt like a shard of ice in Doris's heart as she followed Lily into the store one morning a week after she'd arrived. "What are you both doing in here? Can't you see we're busy?" Levi was getting more short-tempered by the day as the fair approached. "Are you holding the ladder properly, James?" He looked down at his brother, who was handing jars of preserves and pickles up to him. "Sure am," James said amiably. He smiled at Doris and Lily. "Have you come to help? I could do with a hand in the tea room later today if you're not too busy. Maybe you could come and meet some of the customers, Doris. They always like it when Lily's serving." "Am I the only one doing any work here?" Levi demanded. "Don't spoil the day," Lily shot back. "Doris and I are choosing some lengths of ribbon for our dresses, if that's all right." She gave Levi a persuasive smile, and his expression softened. "All right, I suppose it won't harm. Just be sure and tell folks where they can buy some themselves if they compliment you on your outfits," he chuckled. "Look, Doris, I think this color would really suit you." Lily took Doris's hand and pulled her to stand in front of the full-length mirror she had insisted on Levi hanging near the display of ribbons, lace, and bonnets. "Let me take your apron off so we can see how much lace trim we could add to your dress." "Oh no, I don't need anything more to decorate it," Doris said hastily. She tried to hold on to her apron, but Lily had already undone the bow at the back of Doris's waist and whipped it away, hanging it on the back of a nearby chair. "I think green ribbon with cream lace would go very nicely," Lily continued, as she turned to hold them up against Doris. Her bright chatter suddenly petered out as she saw the look of fear and shame on Doris's face and the way she had protectively clasped her hands over the small swell of her belly. Behind them, Levi's face was etched with disbelief and then anger as he scrambled down the ladder, pushing past James. "Is this what I think it is?" he demanded. He grabbed Doris roughly by the shoulders and spun her around to face him. "You're expecting a baby?" His question sliced through the stunned silence like an axe falling. Doris cast her eyes down to the floor, momentarily lost for words. But then she felt the butterfly touch of her baby inside her again, and it gave her the courage she had been seeking. She lifted her head defiantly. She would apologize, but she was not going to be made to feel ashamed of the new life inside of her because it was God's blessing. "I've been trying to find the right time to tell you, Levi," she started. "And you didn't think the first night you arrived might have been a good time." Levi's words dripped with sarcasm. "Maybe you were waiting until you were my wife, so you would have trapped me good and proper?" "It's not like that," Doris insisted. "I said in my letters that I'd been let down by someone, if you recall. The person in question took advantage of me, got me drunk. I didn't even know I was in the family way when we started writing." She twisted her hands, wanting him to understand, but Levi's face was expressionless like a slab of granite, dark and forbidding. "Yes, perhaps I should have told you before I came, but I wanted the chance to tell you to your face like two civilized people, so you could at least give me a chance to explain." "I knew this was a bad idea," he growled. "You've tricked me, and I won't stand for it." A surge of fury ran through Doris's veins, and she put her hands on her hips. "If we're talking about being tricked, you're no better, Levi Bryant. Maybe you could have told me the truth on my first night here as well, huh?" Levi frowned and scratched his head, looking confused. "What are you prattling on about, woman? You're the one telling lies and keeping secrets, not me." "I know everything," Doris said, with a huff of irritation. She knew she was probably ruining her chances of reconciliation by speaking in such a forthright way, but she had to get it off her chest. "The letters? I know you didn't write a word of them. You got James to do them for you. Frankly, you're both as deceitful as each other." She glared between the two brothers, barely noticing that James's expression looked agonized with regret. "You both lured me out to Griffin Creek based on lies and half-truths, and now I don't have enough money to get home again." Yes, I'm expecting a baby. But I'd hoped that if you were the sort of kind-hearted man you portrayed yourself to be in your letters, you might find it in your heart to forgive me and raise the baby with me as man and wife." "I'll do no such thing," Levi bellowed. "If you expect me to raise another man's child, you ain't thinking straight, Doris. Besides, I only wanted to marry you to keep Aunt Maud happy so I could get my inheritance." His eyes snapped with anger as he tried unsuccessfully to control his temper. "In that case, I won't bother you for a moment longer," Doris said firmly. Tears were pricking the back of her eyes, but she was determined not to let Levi see. "I shall pack my things and find a boarding house to stay at. I like it here in Griffin Creek, so I'll see if I can find some work, and I'll pay you back the train fare. Good day to you," she finished. Her chin trembled, and tears pooled in her eyes in spite of her best intentions. Everything she had dreamed of was crumbling all around her. "Don't go," Lily gasped. "I'm sure we can sort something out, Doris. We like you. Stop being so mean, Levi. Tell her to stay. I ain't listening to any more of this rubbish for a moment longer." Levi threw up his hands with disgust and pushed past Lily, intent on getting away. "Look out." James lunged forward, but it was too late. In his anger, Levi hadn't noticed the stack of boxes James had balanced on the shelf next to them, and as Levi barged past in high temper, they tumbled off the shelf, knocking Lily to the ground. "What in the Lord's name is going on?" Maud's voice snapped like the crack of a whip from where she stood in the doorway, making everyone fall silent. "If you were younger, I'd put you over my knee, Levi Bryant. This is no sort of way to treat a lady." "You don't even know what she's done," Levi shot back with a sulky scowl. "Don't be such a fool, Levi. I might be old, but there's nothing wrong with my eyesight. I knew Doris was with child the moment she arrived. This poor woman has left everything she knows behind and traveled all this way to join our family. If she needed a few days to tell us about the baby, well, I ain't going to stand in judgment, and neither should you." Levi's mouth gaped open with surprise, and then he had the grace to give Doris a shamefaced glance of apology. "I guess I was a bit hasty," he mumbled. "Are you forgetting about me?" Lily groaned as she tried to sit up, clutching her arm close to her chest. "I think I've sprained my wrist and I don't feel too good." Her face was ashen, and she looked as though she was about to be sick. "I'm so sorry, Lily. It's all my fault." Doris fell to her knees and put her arm around Lily's shoulder to support her. "It's definitely not your fault," James said. He knelt down on the other side of Lily, and his blue eyes held Doris's gaze. "If anyone should apologize, it's me. I never should have agreed to write the letters. I think we all need a cup of coffee and a moment to catch our breath, don't you?" Aunt Maud had reverted to her usual kindly, practical self, and she gave Levi a pointed look. "You can send for the doctor, Levi. We'd better make sure Lily hasn't broken a bone." As James and Doris helped Lily stand up, Maud patted Doris's shoulder. "As for you, my dear, I won't hear of you leaving. You'll stay on as my guest if you agree. The last thing you need in your condition is to be all alone in a town you've only just arrived at where you don't know a soul." I don't think I should," Doris stuttered. "It's very kind of you to offer, but I don't want to stay after everything I've done to upset Levi." "Nonsense, dear." Maud waved Doris's concerns away, and after a moment, Levi nodded in agreement. "I have a feeling Lily might be unable to work for a few weeks, so we'd be very grateful if you could stay on and help us get ready for the fair. If you still want to leave after that, well, let's cross that bridge when we come to it, shall we?" Doris took a breath, ready to insist she should leave, but then glanced around at the family she had already grown so fond of. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'll do everything I can to make up for what I've done, I promise." Chapter 14. I don't know how we would have managed without you, Doris. Lily had returned to her usual bubbly self now that several weeks had passed since her accident, and was already feeling bored that she couldn't do more. "I'm just grateful I can help out. You were certainly right when you said the town gets busy in the week before the summer fair. Levi said he had his best day ever in the store yesterday." Doris poured Lily a cup of tea and put it on the table in front of her. "That doctor seems very attentive," she added with a chuckle. Lily blushed. and took a sip of her tea. I was expecting old Dr. Evans, not his nephew. She looked down at the sling that was holding her arm in place and smiled. He said he's going to check up on me every week until my wrist is completely better. I'll be keeping an eye on him, Levi said firmly as he strode into the kitchen to grab a cup of coffee. Just because he's a doctor doesn't mean he can take liberties with you, Lily. He is very handsome, though, Lily said with a dreamy expression. I'm sure he's just doing his duty as a doctor is all. She caught Doris's eye, and they shared a smile that made Levi harumph good-naturedly. I guess you'll have to start courting one day, he conceded. Would you like me to help you in the store today? Doris asked. Since the shocking revelations between both of them, Levi had been polite but distant. At first, Doris had felt as though she was walking on eggshells, trying to avoid all mention of their situation. There were so many visitors and new arrivals to the town that the tinkle of the bell on the door announcing a new customer had been non-stop from the moment Levi opened up until closing time. In a way, it was a relief to be so busy. But Doris knew they couldn't avoid talking for much longer. Levi scratched his head, looking thoughtful. It's kind of you to offer, but I think I'll be all right. Lily is going to sit on a chair behind the counter, taking care of the money for me. Doris felt crestfallen for a moment. She had hoped that if she could help him in the store, he would see it as part of her apology and a way for her to make up for her deception. I guess I'll get on with preparing dinner then, she said quietly. Actually, we do need your help. Would you mind working with James in the tea room instead? He was run off his feet yesterday, and I reckon it will be even busier today. Levi drained his coffee cup and hurried off. If he tells you he's doing all right without any help, just ignore him, he added over his shoulder, giving Doris a sudden grin. The tea room's just as important as the general store, and he can be a stubborn man sometimes. Thank goodness those two have come to their senses, Lily muttered as she watched Levi's retreating back. I tell you what, Doris, you're lucky not having brothers. They can both be as stubborn as mules and never want to be the first to back down. Are you sure James won't mind? I don't want him to think I'm interfering. Doris had scarcely seen James since Lily's accident. He had been getting up earlier than the rest of the family and had eaten in the tea room late at night before going straight to bed. He had claimed it was because he wanted to devote all his energy to making the most of summer fair week. But she couldn't help but wonder if he'd been avoiding her. Of course he won't mind, Lily said airily. Besides, I'm sure all the townsfolk will want to come in and get to know you better. She gave Doris a pat on her arm as she passed. Maybe it'll be good for you two to clear the air, huh? He didn't mean any harm with the letters. He's always wanted to help Levi, looked up to his big brother, I suppose. A few minutes later, James looked up with surprise as Doris let herself into the kitchen at the back of the tea room. Levi said you could use some help, Doris explained quickly. She expected to see annoyance or judgment in his eyes, but instead he gave a warm smile. Perfect timing, he said cheerfully. I've made the meat pies already, but if you could help me bake the cakes, that would be wonderful. If you don't mind? Cook used to make the best poppy seed cake I ever tasted. I can't claim to be as good as her, but will that do you? Doris rolled up her sleeves and set to measuring out her ingredients as soon as James nodded gratefully. We're getting busier with each passing year, which is nice to see. And not only visitors either. The locals like to come in and pass the time of day, meeting up with friends. James talked enthusiastically about his customers as they cooked companionably side by side. By turns, Doris found herself laughing at his amusing anecdotes about some of Griffin Creek's most colorful characters, and moved to tears by the caring way he told her about the hardships some families had suffered, from sickness to losing their crops. I can see why you spoke so fondly about the town in the letters. It sounds as if you know everyone, and they all look out for each other. It was the first time Doris had mentioned the letters directly since she had let on she knew James had written them, and there was an awkward pause. I didn't get a chance to properly apologize to you, James said eventually. He eyed the clock on the mantel shelf. We still have an hour until the tea room opens. Will you sit down and have a glass of lemonade with me, Doris? I'd like a chance to explain. Doris nodded. Taking the last of her cakes out of the range oven and putting them on the side to cool. The room filled with the comforting aroma of baking, and she smiled at James. He was easy company, and her heart skipped a beat again as he pulled a chair out for her to sit down and poured her a cool drink. After our parents died, Levi took over as head of the family. He was only 15 years old, and even though Aunt Maud came to look after us, I think he felt responsible for me and Lily, he started. Doris felt a wave of sympathy for them. It must have been a difficult time. I lost my parents too when I was 10, but I always had my sisters to look after me until I went into service. Sounds like we had similar backgrounds. James watched as Doris sipped her lemonade. A tendril of her hair had escaped from her hairpins, and when she smiled, 2 dimples appeared on her cheeks. He couldn't imagine how someone could have taken advantage of her in such a terrible way, and he was suddenly overcome with the urge to protect her from any future harm. "I enjoyed your letters," Doris said shyly. She glanced up at him, wondering if he would be cross for bringing the subject up again. "Hearing all about your life here made me so happy." James took a deep breath and brushed his fingers lightly over Doris's hand. "I didn't mean to deceive you in the letters. At first, I just agreed to write the advertisement for Levi because he's never been one for fancy words." Doris nodded slowly, recognizing that she was the same. "But you carried on?" She wanted to know why he hadn't stopped when he could have done. "When your letters came and he asked me to read them, I found myself feeling intrigued. I couldn't imagine how brave you must be to consider leaving your life behind to come all the way out here. And with each letter we exchanged, I guess I just started looking forward to hearing from you." He gave her a beseeching look. "I know I should have stopped and told him to write his own letters, but it was the first time I'd ever told anyone about our life. My life, I guess. So what happens now?" Doris felt herself softening toward him, comforted by his honesty. "Get to know Levi, Doris. He didn't mean what he said about only wanting to marry you because of his inheritance. That was his pride talking. But what about the baby? He made his feelings pretty clear about that." Doris gave James a wry smile. "I don't blame him for feeling that way either. I knew I was taking a risk, thinking that if we met each other face to face, he might look on me more kindly." She rested her hands on her belly in a gesture as old as time that tugged at James's heartstrings. "He'll come round. Just give him a chance." James stood up, knowing that if they carried on talking, he might be tempted to tell Doris his innermost feelings. "I let myself get carried away in the letters. I guess things got a bit muddled in my mind, writing as if I was Levi." Doris gazed up into his blue eyes, wondering if he was being completely honest with her. The truth was that she wished it had been James who wanted to marry her, but the last thing she wanted was to cause more strife between the brothers by saying it out loud. She pushed back her chair and went to stand up, but suddenly stumbled, not used to the changing shape of her figure. "Careful!" James gently caught her in his arms, steadying her, and the breath caught in Doris's throat as she felt a rush of emotions sweep through her. She quickly looked away. Every fiber of her being wished that the sense of feeling safe and cherished, wrapped within the sanctuary of his arms, could last longer. But she knew it wasn't possible for them to be together. Levi might learn to accept the baby if they ended up married, but surely he would never forgive her for falling in love with his younger brother. As the two of them sprang apart, and James hurried to the tea room door to unlock it, ready for opening, neither of them noticed that Levi had been standing in the shadows of the doorway that joined the 2 sides of the business. He had only intended to come and ask if they needed any supplies from the dry goods, but something about the emotion that crackled in the air between James and Doris had made him pause. Levi rubbed his hand across the stubble on his jaw with an expression that was hard to read before turning on his heel and walking away without saying a word. Chapter 15. The day of the fair quickly arrived, and the excitement in the air was palpable. Every storefront was draped in banners that rippled in the breeze, and the sound of a band playing lively music in the park across the street reached Doris's ears as James threw the door of the tea room open, pinning it back, ready to do business. Children darted between all the families strolling along the sidewalk like shoals of fish, and the cheerful shout of friends greeting each other filled the air. "We told you it was fun, didn't we?" Lily fidgeted as she stood next to Doris, ready to serve the stream of customers who would soon arrive. The counter was laden with all the cakes and tarts that James and Doris had baked around the clock over the preceding days. A big urn of hot water bubbled on the stove for coffee, and there were jugs of lemonade to quench people's thirst. Visiting merchants had set up their stalls along the street, and judging by the riotous hoots of laughter outside the saloon, some of the gold prospectors had already made a start on the barrels of beer that were lined up on the wagon out the front. With each new customer who came in to be served, James would introduce Doris with a twinkle in his eye, so that by the time the rush of people wanting to buy their cakes had started to slow to a more manageable trickle, she felt as though she knew everyone. From old ladies urging her to come and join the sewing circle to freshly shaved ranchers complimenting her on the lightness of her cakes, Doris felt her heart swell with gratitude at how James was going out of his way to make her feel part of their close-knit community. The hours flew by, and she wished the day would last forever. "I think we can say the day was a big success, don't you?" The last customer had just left, and Levi strolled into the tea room, looking weary but happy. "I just counted our takings, and it's the best year yet. We'll be able to make a nice contribution to the church fund and have plenty left to help us get through winter." He picked up the last slice of poppy seed cake and munched on it, grinning at Doris. "I've heard so many folks tell me they enjoyed this. Figured I'd better try a slice for myself, too." James wiped the tables down. "Are we all going across to the park now?" "Oh, yes, please." Lily clapped her hands. "When it starts getting dark is our favorite bit, Doris. The band plays music and they light the bonfires. Plus, we get a chance to walk around the other stalls." "That sounds wonderful." Doris slipped her shawl over her shoulders and linked arms with Lily. "This is the best day I've ever had," she added. As the two of them strolled across to the park, James and Levi followed. "You should show Doris around," James said to his brother. "You know some of the men can get a bit rough after they've been drinking beer all day." Levi gave James a long look. "You're right. There are some things I need to talk to Doris about anyway." He didn't enlarge on what they might be. "Look after her, Levi. She's kinda special." James quickly looked away, not wanting Levi to see the disappointment in his eyes. He could only assume that his brother was finally going to sort the wedding out, especially as he had seen him talking to the new pastor earlier in the day. The thought that Levi and Doris would soon be wed felt like ice freezing in his heart, but he knew he had left it in the Lord's hands, and he was just grateful that Levi was doing the honorable thing. "Maybe I'll go back to the tea room," he added, already turning back. "Wait a minute," Levi said. "That young doctor is making eyes at Lily, so you'd better act as a chaperone until I get back. I won't be long with Doris." He jerked his head toward where the doctor was courteously presenting a flower to Lily and hurried over to Doris, who was watching the band with her foot tapping along in time to the lively waltz they were playing. "Don't mind if I join you?" Levi smiled down at Doris. "When the fiddlers get going later and everyone starts jigging, things can get pretty lively." "I don't think the baby would thank me for joining in with that," Doris chuckled. "Let's take a walk. There's something I need to get off my chest." Levi tucked Doris's hand into the crook of his arm and steered her across the grass to a quieter spot. "I'm sorry, Levi. I didn't mean to deceive you." Doris knew she had to apologize again, now that they had the chance to talk calmly. What she'd said to him before had been in the heat of the moment, and she felt like it hadn't really counted. "James has explained about the letters. I guess we're all to blame for this whole mess a little bit," Levi shrugged. "The thing is, Doris, it's not that I don't want to marry you, but I don't blame you for how you feel, Levi. I should have written about the baby before coming here." Doris shot him a rueful smile. "I can be a bit hot-headed myself, you know. I thought from the letters that I was madly in love with you, and you were with me. But the reality was a bit different. And I got swept away with the thought that you were kind-hearted and wouldn't mind about the baby once you'd gotten used to the idea." Doris pulled away slightly. It's probably for the best that I leave soon and find work. I'm not too proud to make my own way, and I want the best for my baby. I'm sure I could get work in a boarding house or something. No, let me finish. The urgency in Levi's tone made Doris stop and turn back to him. The reason why I can't marry you isn't because of the baby. It's not, but you said, I know, I was very rude, and I hope you'll forgive me. Levi waited for Doris to nod before continuing. The reason why I can't marry you is that James is in love with you, and I think you're in love with him too. His words came out in a rush, and he grinned at her. I'm right, aren't I? I know it. Well, I have been wondering. Doris blushed, feeling her eyes drawn across the park to where she could see James hovering next to Lily and the doctor. He looked thoroughly miserable and quickly looked away after sneaking a glance in her direction. James thinks I'm asking you to marry me, Levi explained, following her gaze. But I know it would be a mistake. You and James are more suited than any two people I've ever known. He gave her a sudden grin. I happen to know the new pastor is taking bookings to do weddings already. Doris couldn't help but laugh. You've thought of everything. But what about you, Levi? Wouldn't you feel resentful toward James? Nope. I just want my little brother to be happy, Doris. I know I can come across as a bit unfeeling, but I care for my family more than anything in the world, and that includes you too now. He gave her a gentle nudge and nodded in his brother's direction. You don't owe me anything. Now go on and put a smile on James's face, won't ya? The poor man looks like he's chewing on a lemon, thinking we're getting wed. You won't find a better pa than him for your baby either, he added gruffly. He's a kind man, and he'll look after you both the way you deserve. Doris felt like she was walking on air as she hurried toward James. Now that things had been put right between her and Levi, and they had forgiven each other, it was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Have you set a date for the wedding, then? James avoided her eye, kicking the toe of his boot on the grass. I reckon Lily and the doctor won't be far behind. He seems quite smitten with her. Levi and I aren't getting married, James, Doris said softly. We're not right for each other, and he's not the man I fell in love with from those letters. You are. James's head whipped up, and he looked uncertainly into her face, with hope hovering in his blue eyes. Is that true, Doris? I've prayed about this every night since you arrived. At first, it was that my feelings for you might go away, but lately, it was that you would forgive me for writing the letters. And it's true from the depths of my heart, Doris said, resting her hand against his chest. But I have to ask you something. She took a deep breath, knowing that her dream of being with James could be about to crumble to dust before they'd even gotten started, depending on his answer. Will you be able to love this baby as your own, James? Because I don't think I could bear to be with you otherwise. James paused for a moment and then swept Doris into his arms, gently kissing her on the lips before resting his hand on her waist. I already do love you and the baby, Doris, more than I can say. Will you marry me? Will you let me cherish and love you and the baby forever and make me a very happy man? Doris reached up and stroked his cheek, drinking in every line of the face which had become so dear to her. I will, James. And Levi just told me the pastor is already booking weddings. She chuckled as they turned to see Levi strolling toward them with a delighted expression on his face. I think that was his way of giving us his blessing, don't you? James nodded happily. Trust him to have thought of that already. He put his arm around Doris and called to Lily and Maud, who were watching from nearby. Doris and I have some wonderful news. She's agreed to marry me, and we're going to be a family. Not only that, but we'll soon have the next generation of Bryants to bring into the business. Levi shook hands with James. Congratulations to you both. I know you're going to be very happy together. Now, if you'll excuse me, there's someone I need to talk to. Lily and Maud came hurrying over. I knew they'd see sense in the end, Maud chuckled. Welcome to the family, my dear. We'll have so much fun planning the wedding, Lily gushed. I'm going to make you a new dress, and we'll need a christening gown, too. James looked proudly down at Doris, and she smiled up at him as they strolled toward the bonfire, where the sparks were already floating upward into the darkening sky. I love you, Doris, and I'll always be grateful for your courage to come out to Griffin Creek. It's as if the Lord knew we were meant to be together. You know what, James? I never used to believe in miracles, but by God's grace, I think you're right. Her heart swelled as she looked around before her gaze came to settle on James again. I'm marrying the love of my life, and I'll be part of a wonderful family who has welcomed me with open arms. Well, eventually, James chuckled, even if we did have a few hiccups along the way. Doris's heart skipped a beat as he brushed a lock of hair from her cheek. After everything that had happened, things had worked out perfectly. She smiled as she felt the butterfly kicks of her baby deep inside. Thank you, Lord. Thank you for bringing this kind-hearted man into our lives. Her silent prayer drifted upward along with the smoke from the bonfire, and Doris realized this was the happiest moment of her life. Epilogue. Papa! Papa! Carry me! Doris smiled as she watched her daughter toddling around the tea room, eager to be picked up by James. Come on up then, Enid. James scooped her up and blew a raspberry on her cheek, making her squeal with delight. The cakes are ready to take outside, Doris called, as she bustled past with a tray of cakes to the long table out the front of the store. She couldn't help but think about how much her life had changed during the last 3 years. The days of running up and down the stairs doing chores for Jane Ricci felt like a distant memory, and in her last letter, Mrs. Batchley had told her how much she was enjoying her retirement and how well Wendy was doing now that she had trained as a seamstress. It had turned out the girl had a natural flair for making garments and could whip up a new dress in no time. Things had changed at Bryant's General Store and Tea Room as well. After Doris and James's wedding, Levi had announced that he had been offered a job as a traveling salesman, asking Aunt Maud if she would give her blessing. At first, she had been shocked that Levi would want to leave Griffin Creek, but James had pointed out that it was just Levi taking after their pa, who had always enjoyed the thought of exploring the country, even if he'd only ever gotten to take several journeys during his life. After a long night of discussions, Maud had conceded that there was no point in Levi staying if his heart wasn't in it, and James had reassured her that they were more than capable of keeping the business going now that Doris was here to help. The only sadness was that Levi had missed Enid's birth. And then, when young Dr. George Evans asked for Lily's hand in marriage, it had been James who had agreed. I hope you're not overdoing things. You shouldn't be on your feet all day. James caught Doris around the waist as she passed, giving her a soft smile. I'm made of tougher stuff than it looks, Doris shot back with a teasing smile. Didn't I help you with our cabin roof? Exactly. James glanced down at her swollen belly, and his eyes shone with happiness. You were carrying our child, and you didn't even tell me, clambering up and down that ladder for days on end. What's our baby boy going to think of that when I tell him? Doris chuckled. You seem pretty sure it's going to be a boy. What if it's a sister to keep Enid company? You know, I'll be happy either way. But don't forget we said we wanted 3 or 4 children to fill our new home, he added with a twinkle in his eye that made Doris's heart melt. Now that Lily and George were expecting their first child, Maud had decided that it was getting to be a bit of a squeeze for them all in the original cabin out back. She had offered to help pay toward James and Doris building a cabin of their own at the far end of the paddock. It will be close enough for me to spend time with Enid and the new baby, without us all being on top of each other, she had said, patting Doris's hand. Doris and James had yearned to have their own space to raise a large family, but she was glad that it meant they would still be close to the rest of the family. Lily felt like a sister to her, and she already had visions of the cousins all playing together in the garden and then helping in the business as they all grew older. I like doing the summer fair this way, James said. This year, they had decided to set up several tables out the front of the business. The tea room was doing so well that they had closed the general store at noon and would be serving refreshments outside so they could feel part of the event instead of being stuck inside. Lily had sewn gingham tablecloths for each table after hearing that it was all the vogue back east, and there were chairs dotted around the tables where folks were already gathering for one of James and Doris's famous picnic teas. Doris smiled up into James's deep blue eyes, which still captivated her and made her heart skip a beat. "I never imagined we'd be this happy." "I did," James replied with a wink. "That first evening when we sat in the kitchen with the candles lit, I could hardly take my eyes off you. I felt as though all my prayers had been answered." Doris raised an eyebrow, looking puzzled. "I never would have known. If anything, I wondered if you were avoiding me." James looked momentarily guilty. "I had to give Levi a fair chance at courting you. I know I wrote the letters, but it was his idea to look for a wife. You might have fallen head over heels in love with him, given a bit of time." "That never would have happened," Doris said quickly, reaching up to stroke James's cheek. "I fell in love with the man who revealed his heart to me in each and every word of those precious letters. I read them so many times they were practically falling apart." She had long ago stopped feeling guilty that things hadn't worked out between her and Levi, and she hoped James had too. "Speaking of letters, I forgot to tell you I had one from Levi this morning." James pulled it from his jacket pocket and opened it. "He's still not one for fancy words by the look of things," he added, smiling at how short it was. He read it out loud. "Dear James and Doris, I have decided to return to Griffin Creek next month, so I thought I should let you know. I have lots of new stock for the store, which I think will sell like hotcakes. Although I've enjoyed traveling, I find myself hankering for home again and missing you all. I expect my little niece Enid must be running around by now, and I hope I'll be back in time to be there to welcome the new babies in the family as well. My final bit of news might surprise you. The young lady I mentioned in my last letter is now my wife. Audrey and I got wed last week, and she's looking forward to settling down with us all back at home. See you all soon, Levi." "That's wonderful news," Doris said, smiling broadly. "He's had his adventure, and now he's coming home again, where he belongs." James slipped his hand around Doris's waist and gazed down into her eyes. "I always knew you were special," he murmured. "You never held a grudge against Levi when some women would have done, and you had the courage to come out west as a mail-order bride even though you didn't know us. I put my trust in the Lord, James." Doris leaned into the comforting circle of his arm and sighed with contentment, smiling as they watched Enid climb onto Maud's lap so they could share a piece of cake. "I prayed for a kind-hearted man to marry and raise a family with, and look, I got all that and more." She smiled again as James nodded, resting her hand on her belly as she felt another kick deep inside. She hadn't told James yet that all of her sister's second babies had been boys. Her heart lifted with happiness as she thought about their future together. They were truly blessed, and she had a feeling that it wouldn't be much longer before their son arrived to make their life even richer. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.